Chapter 22. Tristan began fiddling with his cabinet like there was a point to it, keeping his hands occupied so he wouldn't have to think about what he had just walked away from. When he saw her approaching from the corner of his eye, it was almost a relief. Shalini Goel was the shortest of all the trial takers, barely 5 feet 5 by his guess, and though she was full-bodied, the thief could tell it was not the result of idleness. There was muscle to her frame and calluses on her palms. The same kind Guardia sometimes got, those come from shooting regularly. Her black hair was long, kept in a braid going down her back, and she had a gold ring in her nose. The vivid shades of her clothes spoke of coin even for Ramayan, a people whose love of color was proverbial. A green kurta, the collarless tunic in the Someshwar manner, ended above her knees, leading into striped trousers in white and yellow that were tucked into high boots. A blood-red sash at her waist had 2 pistols tucked into, while her leather bandolier holding powder horns hung loose across her torso, connecting a shoulder to the opposite side. Shalini had the look of a soldier but did not hold herself like one, which spoke to Tristan of someone who had been trained but not taken to such a life. And while he'd been studying her, he realized she had studied him right back. "Tristan, is it?" She smiled. "I don't believe we have been properly introduced." She had an easy smile, he decided, but it was not false. Shalini Goel struck him instead as one of those strange people Vesper had blessed with a general enjoyment of life. It must make her easy to like. It felt like a long journey here, but it ended up being so little time, hasn't it? Tristan smiled back, entirely practiced. She offered her hand to shake, which he did. Her grip was firm. "I am Shalini Goel," he said, then shrugged at her raised eyebrow. "Word gets around." "I suppose it does," she chuckled. "And you even pronounced it right." "Do you?" Shalini said something he did not understand in what he was pretty sure was Samratrava, the most common of the Someshwari languages. Tristan answered with the only sentence in that language he had ever learned. "The brothels are down the canal with red lanterns," he informed her. A flicker of complete and utter surprise, then Shalini burst out laughing. It was contagious enough that he found himself smiling as she slapped her knee, holding her stomach. "Oh gods," the Ramayan wheezed. "I guess that's an answer. How much did they pay you to tell the sailors?" "Only 3 radizas a night, but it came with a meal," Tristan said. He saw her pause, count in her head as she translated from the currency Sacramonte and most of the Trebians she used to coin it she better knew. The imperial Someshwar had a few, but Yala, Sheshahala, in truth, but not even Someshwari used the full name, were the only one he'd ever seen used at the docks. The private currencies of the Rajas were rarely accepted, given how regularly they got debased when the latest palace or campaign got a little too expensive. "So not even 2 kappa," she mused. "I hope it was a good meal." "I've had worse," the thief shrugged. And taking the coppers had given him a reason to hang around Caballo Canal at night, letting him track the coming and goings of a Meng Xiao Fein warehouse he had been sent by Abuela to rob. "I expect you have," Shalini said, mood losing some of the humor. "It seems to have hardened you in useful ways." It was his turn to cock an eyebrow at her. She was the one who had come to him, after all, so it was her who should make the pitch. "Tredegar is being run by the Infanzones," Shalini Goel told him, "and we both know Xickle's worse than a snake. A leopard society man through and through." "I have never heard of them before," the thief admitted. "I wouldn't expect a Sacramontan to have," she said. "Iskli named their societies after animals from their homeland that embody traits they want to emulate, Tristan. But there are no leopards in the kingdom of Iskli." Tristan blinked in surprise. "They are not a formal society," Shalini said. "When forced to acknowledge their existence, the Grasshopper King will say they are charged with hunting criminals that flee outside Iskli borders, but what they really do is raid." She spat to the side. "They go out with the candle priests, hit undefended villages out in the Someshwar or the republics and bring them back like cattle," Shalini said. He grimaced in disgust, not faking it in the least. "For the candles?" She nodded and he almost spat as she had. The kingdom of Iskli had been one of the strongest nations to emerge from the fall of the Second Empire, with fertile heartlands full of antediluvian wonders and its strong military bent, but its unification was a bloody business. Iskli was hardly alone in that, but what set the kingdom apart was that it was heavily dependent on First Empire lights to live, and almost all of them were on the ground instead of set in firmament. During the wars many were damaged, which had unbalanced the intricate system of devices regulating light in Iskli. Entire regions had begun to go dark for weeks, months even, until the men now known as the Candle Priests found their solution: feed the machines either way they grew weak. Nowadays Iskli claimed the era of bloody sacrifices, of murdering men on altars to keep the lights from burning out, was long past. That it had been much exaggerated anyhow, a very rare happenstance, and that advances in modern understanding of ether now made such savagery obsolete. There were kinder ways to keep the candles lit, needing no death and hardly any pain. It had not stopped flower wars from erupting at Iskli borders, and such assurances from the grasshopper kings were taken with a heavy grain of salt. With good reason, if Shalini spoke the truth about the leopard society. They are expendable, the Ramayan said. If they get caught, become an embarrassment, they will be called rogues or bandits and left to hang. Xikl came by that ugliness honestly, whatever else may be said of him. And there is much to be said, Tristan Raleigh replied. Figured you'd agree, Shalini grinned. You can see the same things I can, Ishan and I, we're your best bet. He smiled at her, saying nothing. That young comes with is another point in your favor, she acknowledged, but after the way Lady Firanda talked you up I would have made an offer anyway. You, he said, and not Lord Ishan. I find that interesting. It's not a slight, Shalini assured him, it's just that he is a little scrambled at the moment. By now you'll have heard we ran into the Erevaton before you did. And that a contract was used to buy enough time for your crew to escape, Tristan said. Firanda Vilazar had claimed that something stupefied the beast long enough for them to run away. That it was contract work was not in doubt, and he had already suspected it was Ishan, but to hear it confirmed made the guess solid. There was some backlash, she said. Hard not to, beating back a monster that large. But he's nearly through it and will be back to form by tomorrow. He's just, going to get confused easily until then. It's best for me to do the talking while he recovers. She paused. If your worry is that I make promises he won't keep, there is no need, Shalini reassured him. He's not insensate, it just takes a while for him to understand things. Everything I say with his approval. It was tempting to keep stringing her along, see if he could get any more information out of her, but that was greed talking. If he took too much before declining, he would be salting the grounds. Best to end this now and add a little sweetness. So they remained on good terms. It is a tempting offer, he said. But, Shalini said. I won't be going into the maze tomorrow, Tristan said. Not with anyone. She drummed her fingers against the side of a pistol. Hedging your bets is not unreasonable, she grudgingly said. And we have had longer to rest. But it was not the answer she had wanted, and perhaps even expected, so now for the sweetness. Yang will not refuse if you ask him again, Tristan said. He does not want to wait. Shalini eyed him with interest. Is that what you two were speaking about? We are inclined to different strategies, Tristan shrugged. She would come out of it with another shot at the companion she had wanted more than he, but more important still she would come out of their conversation with the feeling that she had won. Getting her hands on a source of tension between he and Yang was worth more than some talk about a suspected contract and idle conversation about the Leopard Society. Their conversation remained genial and Tristan suspected she might have stayed longer if she had not caught sight of something. Brun was approaching Ishan there. Shalini made her excuses quickly after that, going to join them. That's another one for their crew, then, the thief thought. Brun was fit, loyal, he had backed Tredegar against Tupac, and came with no baggage attached. He was, in essence, a perfect replacement for Uretsi. Like her the blonde Sacromontan had made few waves and come out of the perils with a solid reputation. And that made Tristan uncomfortable, because Fortuna had called the god he was bound to loud. It did not necessarily follow that a contractor must be alike in nature with their contracted. He had little enough in common with Fortuna, but allowed God out to be loud in their gifts, yet no a single whisper had spread of Brun's contract. The other man had navigated the game of alliances with a deft hand. He'd gotten in with the infant zones when the getting was good through the more influential of Isabel Ruesta's maids, then stuck closely to Tredegar. A woman who would bite her own arm off before raising a hand against a comrade, a category Brun had made certain to fit in. Now he was changing ship for the Ramayans, getting into a more stable crew, but carefully burning no bridges as he did. "You are certain his god is the loud one?" Tristan murmured, feigning a yawn. "Yes," Fortuna flatly replied. "And he is being incredibly tasteless about it." She did not deign to elaborate further, and he knew better than to ask. "There's something off about you, Brun," Tristan decided. No one genuinely following sentiment ended up making all the right choices all the time. The other man was running a game, had to be. But which, and for what purpose? No answers would be found standing here, the thief knew, so he tore his gaze away. Whatever it was Brun wanted, if his ambitions extended beyond survival, then it would be something to chase after later. Tristan had more pressing matters to worry about, 3 of them to be exact. Francho was the most likely to have other offers, but Tristan still sought out Vanessa first. It was she whose expertise would determine whether his intentions were at all feasible. The old woman was sitting by herself in a corner, looking half asleep. The watch physician had her on poppy extract for the pain, but Tristan had checked the vials and the man was keeping the doses as low as he could. It was for the best, at her age. Too strong a dose risked sending her into the kind of sleep she would not be waking from. Not much had been done about the shattered leg, aside from cleaning it and binding it, but that was not laziness on the man's part. The Aravaton had broken the limb beyond repair, bone-shredding muscles and tendons as it shattered into pieces. Her kneecap was in 3 pieces, and the swelling made it nearly impossible to operate and stem the internal bleeding. The physician had little choice but to recommend amputation. Either way, the watchman had told her, "You won't ever be using that leg again." Vanessa had balked at that. Tristan had spent long enough as a cutter's assistant to know that was not an uncommon reaction, but it had been startlingly ferocious. She went hysterical for a time, needing to be restrained until she calmed, and had been subdued since. The one-eyed clockmaker was awake enough to notice when he came to sit by her side, though her face betrayed her exhaustion. "Is it time for lunch?" Vanessa asked. "Not for a few hours yet," Tristan said. No one would be leaving anytime soon, anyhow. He thought some of the crews might set out to have a look at the shrines later this afternoon, but doubted anyone would begin the maze until tomorrow. First they would want to recover and organize. "Ah," she muttered. "Sorry. My mind, it has been wandering." "Common enough when taking poppy extract," he assured her. She nodded, looking thankful. As if he had not simply said the truth. "A nice young woman from the watch is making me crutches," Vanessa told him. "From an old ore, I believe?" He said nothing. "Anyhow," Vanessa continued, "when they are finished I will be able to have a look at this maze. It seems an interesting enough place." Sometimes, Tristan thought, the line between kindness and cruelty was thin as a breath. "You know you won't be doing that," he quietly said. "Perhaps not in one of these companies forming," Vanessa said, "but surely, if you go into that maze, you will die." He interrupted as gently as he could, but his voice did not waver. It was a statement of fact, not a guess. Tristan had little heard of the tests these gods of the maze would set, but a one-eyed old woman with a broken leg would be as meat on the table. Vanessa's lips pursed, then she looked away. He saw the emotions flicker across her worn face, frustration, anger, fear. And at the end of the road, resignation. "I am dead if I stay here," she finally said. "The physician says I have 2 weeks at most, with the bleeding inside the leg." Much as he wanted to bring up the amputation again, it was not his place. Vanessa knew the costs of her decision. They had been made plain to her. If she thought a slow death better than losing her leg, then it was her choice to make. "There may be," Tristan said, "another way." Her eye went to him, as if dragged by a hook. The hope he saw there burned, for there were no certainties in what he had to offer. "Have you had a close look at the gate?" he asked. "I have not," she admitted. "Then let us," Tristan said. "I think you will find it interesting." He went about it methodically. First he took one of the spare benches near the kitchen and moved it in front of the gate, then went back for Vanessa. She had to lean on him all the while, most of her weight carried for her, but he got her to the bench and helped her down. She was barely paying attention by the time he did, so light flittering across the span of the iron gate, or, more precisely, the intricate mechanisms covering it. "I cannot tell where it begins," she murmured. "Oh, and some parts go into the gate. Pistons, Tristan, see those? That will be etheric machinery, unless they have a steam engine on the other side that can run forever. Can you make any sense of it?" he asked. "The grids are the key," Vanessa told him, "I still on the gate. See how the gears around them are all derivative? Those metal plaques are the functional equivalent of levers, or perhaps more accurately a combination lock. Moving them would have an effect," Tristan said. Vanessa nodded. "Absolutely," she said. "Mind you, there are a few distinguishing marks on them and I do not see how anyone could easily get up there to activate them." But she paused, enthusiasm slowly bleeding out of her as she turned to him. "It is an interesting puzzle," Vanessa said, "but it will not get either of us through the maze. I do not need a distraction, Tristan." "Yes you do," the thief thought. "Else she would simply wither on the vine. Better yet that this was not a distraction at all." "I disagree," Tristan murmured. "I think that gate is exactly how we get through the maze." He gestured at the gate. "The stone around it isn't the same as the forts," he said. "And the scale of the structure it is set in is absurd. While the stone the gate was set in a pillar, as it reached all the way to the distant ceiling of the cavern, it perhaps ought to be called a tower instead for the sheer size of it. It was at least 100 feet long from side to side, at the apex of the curve. So perhaps it is a First Empire ruin," Vanessa shrugged. "That is no surprise given the great machinery above our heads." "You are not paying attention to the right part," Tristan chided her. "The pillar is in perfect state. This old fort, however, is falling apart." The old woman stared at him, still uncomprehending. "It was built later, not by the antediluvians," the thief said. "And to guard what? A gate it would take 10 batteries of cannons to break through." "I doubt it. And that leaves only the shrines," Vanessa said. "The maze. You believe it is also a recent addition?" "I do," Tristan agreed. "And now that begs the question, what is that pillar for, then? Where does the gate lead?" The clockmaker's lone eye dipped upwards, at the pieces of gold slowly moving above them and giving out a ghostly golden glow. "Even antediluvians needed to maintain their machines," Vanessa softly said. "However fine the make, they fell apart eventually. And they would need a way to get up there," Tristan murmured. "I believe we are looking at it." Vanessa hesitated. "There is no guarantee that up there waits a path across the mountains," she said. Tristan could have said that even the antediluvians must have brought the pieces in from somewhere, that if the maze of shrines was recent and a god bound to the gate on the other side then that very gate might be just as a recent an addition, but at the end of the day she was right, there was no guarantee. "It is a bet," Tristan admitted. He met her eye squarely. "But I believe in it enough to hold off on the maze," he said. Tristan was a rat. Could there be a stronger endorsement from the likes of him than putting his own fortunes on the line? His life was the sole thing of worth he owned. He said nothing more, letting the silence do the talking. The Sacramontan knew she would agree, for Aslan had seen the truth was Vanessa did not truly want to die. She was resigned to it, perhaps, but if the choice was between the certain death of entering the maze as a lone cripple and rolling the dice on the gate they both knew what she would choose. Tristan did not hurry her, letting her make the journey at her own pace until she was staring down at her ruin of a leg. There was a bitterness to the cast of her face that came to it more often these days. "Well," Vanessa said, "I suppose there is not much left for me to lose." She sighed. "Only the two of us?" she asked. "I want Francho as well," the thief immediately replied. "And I have recruited outside helpers." "Of course you have," the old woman readily smiled. "You may count me as part of your cabal, then. I look forward to seeing what comes of it." He would have stayed longer, sitting with her, but she dismissed him. "Wanted to look at the gate without distractions," she said, but if he wanted to be a dear he could see about getting her ink and paper. That would have to wait, he decided, until he had spoken with Franco. The old professor was speaking with Lan when he found him, the blue-lipped dealer departing in a huff when she saw him. Franco cocked a brow at the thief, but Tristan rolled his eyes. "I will ask no questions, then," the toothless old man drawled. "What may I do for you, young man?" "Answer a few questions of mine, for one," he said. "Had I known all along that all it took was the threat of grisly death to seed curiosity in my students," Franco smiled, "I might have dabbled in it at ref. It might have shortened your career," the thief sadly replied. "Oh, murder is the least of the offenses one can get away with after tenure," Franco said. "The old master of music once." But I am rambling again. "Please, do ask away." Tristan was going to come back and get that story about the master of music later, for it promised to be most amusing, but it would have to wait. "I expect Lan was approaching you on behalf of Tupac Sickle," the thief leadingly said. "The Eastly is most forthright about wanting cannon fodder," Franco said. "The honesty of the offer is somewhat admirable." "You don't seem to be biting at the bait," Tristan said. "I thought it unwise before finding out what it is you were plotting," the professor candidly said. "You do not seem to be joining up with anyone, which has me wondering what you do intend." "There is a mystery in the bones of this trial," the thief said. "I would dig it out." Franco considered him, sucking at his gums thoughtfully. "The gate," he said. "You want to open the gate?" "An endeavor in which a historian might be of some use," Tristan said. "Especially one with fine ears." The reference to his contract was not particularly subtle, but neither was it too telling. And he did want Franco on his side, if not strictly speaking need him. If the gate were easy to open, the watch already would have. Having someone could listen to what had gone on around the Great Pillar, to parse out the parts of the puzzle they unearthed, would be very useful indeed. It would starkly increase their odds of success, in Tristan's opinion. "An interesting offer," Franco finally said. It was not agreement, but neither was it a refusal. Unlike Vanessa, the old professor might potentially survive delving the maze. The risks were merely high, especially if he went in under the likes of Tupac. "Think on it," Tristan simply said. "I will not be going anywhere." His odds, he thought, were good. He would know by the end of the day what kind of a crew it was he was working with. Mariam only reappeared an hour later and avoided talking about where she had been. Of Beatrice there was still no sign, which had him reconsidering how he would get eyes on Angharad Tredegar's crew, but before that question was answered there was another conversation he wanted to have. "Not while people are around," Mariam whispered. "Especially the watch." So they waited for night to meet, even as Tupac's crew and Ishan's went to have a look at the shrines. Tredegar, by contrast, seemed to be preparing her own for combat, putting them into formation, preparing weapons. An hour before the watch dimmed the lanterns, Franco approached him. "If it leads nowhere, I will have to turn to the maze," the old professor warned. "I would not ask you otherwise," Tristan replied. And like that, there were only 2 stones left to turn over. Tristan considered night one of the more interesting lies people told themselves. It rested at a lively intersection between need, tradition and control. Men must sleep, they could only stay awake for so long, therefore there must be an end to the day, a night where rest was allowed. Yet in most of Vesper there was no natural boundary to delimit this, only a few old wonders of the antediluvians underwriting such a cycle in fact. It was thus in the hands of men to delimit night and day, to make them, and there the lie got interesting. Was a stretch of hours to be called night because your parents had called it such? Tradition had weight, it was true. If you were raised to be awake at certain hours and asleep at others, you might not question it. But those hours were not the same for everyone, were they? Half the miners of the trench lived during night, their little towns outside the walls of Sacramento living askew in time from the rest of the city, and they were hardly the only ones. And it was not tradition that had made the decision, for who would ever choose to work in the hell of the trench? It was those with power who had set the lines, the boundaries. It was they who decided when the lamplights limned and when they burned, when men worked and when they rested. Abuela had once told him that about 40 years ago, the infanzones of infanzones, had tried to take an hour out of the night. They had wanted the docks and markets open longer, for those were the arteries of wealth in the city, and sooner or later all of Sacramonte's wealth made its way into the hands of the six. They'd not announced this or trumpeted it about, instead sneaking it in as a natural thing. The lights had stayed on, the shifts been extended. The public clocks were tampered with or taken down for repairs, leaving people to measure time by the eye, and the scheming few had thought that if this went on for long enough without notice they could steal an entire hour from the many. It had not worked, Abuela had told him. People with little always notice that when you took something from them. Somewhere around 3,000 people died in the Canario riots, after the mob began storming noble mansions, and the Guardia answered by wheeling out organ guns and firing them into the crowd. Afterwards, smelling disaster, the six hung a dozen ringleaders after accusing them of having taken coin from the republics. It was all a foreign plot. And after that show of strength promptly backed down. The debacle with the stolen time was blamed on a single family, House Arlegan, which was exiled as the six once more protected the rights of the good people of Sacramonte. The hour went back, the clocks were all mysteriously fixed within a week, all the world was pleased. And the infanzones quietly began building workers' towns outside the city walls, where criminals and the indebted would agree that day and night were whatever their betters said they were. What was the lesson of that story? Tristan had asked Abuela. There is no such thing as night, she'd said. Yet look at the storm of violence that was unleashed when men tried to change the span of it. An old lie is a powerful thing, Tristan. Learn to use them. To the boy he'd been when they first had a conversation it had meant little. As he grew older, though, the words began to take meaning. It was not a secret or a trick Abuela had been trying to teach him but a perspective. The things taken for granted, the foundations that Vesper rested on, should not be spared a skeptical eye. The chains that bound men most surely were those they never saw, never thought to strain against. Tristan was no confederales, to plot the bloody liberation of Sacramonte with a butcher's knife on his lap and a red circle sewn over his heart, but he would not suffer being owned. So he learned to keep his eyes open, to sniff out the lies. And this trial of ruins, it reeked. Enough that it was forcing him to look back at the entire dominion of lost things and wonder what it was that the Watch truly wanted with this place. He had come here treading on a foundation of certainty. The Blastcloaks used the trials to bring in skilled but irregular recruits, while fattening their pockets by letting the nobles use them as proving grounds. Perhaps a little posturing thrown in as well, an unspoken reminder that at the end of the trials the infanzones used to set themselves above one another. All that the victors qualified to be was the rank and file of the Watch. Only the numbers didn't add up. Even if Tristan was willing to dismiss the way trial takers were chosen, and he wasn't, not when he had to wonder if the Blastcloaks would actually want half of the people who'd paid to get on the Blue Belt. There was a larger discrepancy behind it all. Coin. How many infanzones? How many Red Games candidates were sent every year? Possibly enough to keep an old cog like the Blue Belt and the other ship the first wave had taken afloat. Their crews paid, but not much more than that. Then the Watch would have to pay and feed the garrison on the Dominion, to supply and maintain its forts, to defend them against the cultists of the Red Eye. In the most generous of suppositions, if 100 people took to the Dominion every year and half of these survived to become Watch, a very generous supposition, then after the losses to sickness, gods and cultists were subtracted, the Blastcloaks couldn't be getting more than a dozen net recruits or so. And for those dozen recruits they'd be drenching their ledger in red. He had thought this explained the seeds and trade goods he and Mariam had figured out at the docks. The Watch was trying to get some gold out of this place and perhaps lower its casualties with bribes. But now here they got to the trial of ruins. A horror of dead and dying gods under a First Empire ether machine that had to be worth a small city. Why hadn't they stripped that thing out and sold it to make a fortune? If they feared the gods of the maze enough to threaten the execution of anyone contracting with one without reporting it, why not fill this place to the brim with black powder and light a fuse? No, there was something going on here beyond the watch running a seemingly sloppy recruitment operation. And instead of running around in the maze with the rest of them, Tristan the Brascal was going to find out what it was the Blastcloaks knew the rest of them didn't. The first step to that, in an unusual turn, was not to be all that difficult. There was one person who knew more about these trials than she should, and they were already set to talk. Miriam had promised, in the heat of the moment when the Erevaton seemed set to kill them, that they were to have a conversation. It was a one best kept away from prying eyes, she had claimed, so Tristan used an old lie in the very simplest of ways. They waited until night made everyone go to sleep. Not every trick had to be bold or brilliant. They met in one of the broken bastions under a ceiling half collapsed, surrounded by loose masonry. The Blastcloaks didn't patrol, not really. They kept watch from atop the walls and sometimes went around the fortress to eye the courtyard, but they had no interest in the nooks and crannies of the old fort. They are not afraid of animals or lemures, Tristan decided. Given Lieutenant Wen's enthusiastic oration about gods eating each other, he suspected there might not be any around. Miriam came in but a few heartbeats after him, hand on the knife at her side as her blue eyes scanned the dark. He pushed off of the stone he'd been leaning against, passing under the broken ceiling and the rays of gold pouring down it. Her shoulders relaxed. "You know," Miriam said, "if someone else had asked me into a dark corner after everyone went to sleep, I might have assumed they had intentions." He cocked an eyebrow. "But not me?" She rolled her eyes. "I'm not blind, Tristan," she said. "You are about as interested in bed sports as I am in collecting butterflies. A traditional hobby, if largely pointless," he said. He had not specified which he was talking about, which by the look of her grin she had absolutely noticed. Much as he disliked sobering the mood after such a pleasant start, he had not come here for the pleasure of her company. Seeing the change in his expression, Miriam's own shed the mirth. "And now I pay my dues, yes?" she said. "I would not dig into your personal secrets," Tristan said, "but I have questions and you answers." She dismissed his words with a wave. "I made my choice out on the plains and will not walk it back now," Miriam said. "There are limits to what I may speak of, but within them I will not balk." "You said," Tristan murmured, "that this year was not like the others. That some of us were marked for more than simply joining the watch." Miriam slowly nodded. She was considering her words, navigating promises, perhaps? And ultimately it was with a question she answered. "What strikes you as strange about the Bluebell passengers?" He cocked his head to the side. He'd given that subject much thought, now that he had time to spare and more information to chew on. "You and Leander Galatas could both use signs," he said. "And not the way some street witch would, the usual potions and curses. The real kind of signs, those navigators use. That is more than passing rare." She nodded encouragingly. "There are also much too many people with contracts," he added after a moment. "It seems like at least half the foreigners have one. Zenzalduma did, and Ishanir." The same was likely true of Tupac Sickle, and Tristan sincerely doubted that even a mirror dancer could be as quick as Angharad Tredegar without a little help. Throw in song, Akane Thifos, Isabel Ruesta, Brown and Francho, then on top of that the rumor that Raymond Cheriton had one as well. The numbers were troubling. Even if no one else was hiding a contract, which he had doubts about, then out of the 33 people on the Bluebell there had been at least 12 with contracts, counting himself and Marzella. It was a staggering number even for individuals aiming to enter the watch. Someone might well go their entire life without meeting that many contractors, much less all of them in the same room. All the recommended are being evaluated to see if they qualify for special enrollment, Miriam told him. "Yourself included." "Special enrollment?" he pressed. "I cannot speak about it," she admitted. "I skirt the edge of breaking an agreement by even telling you this much." As he'd thought, her foreknowledge had come with strings. It only reinforced that he was speaking to the right person to find the thread he must pull at, because the most likely suspect for Miriam's interlocutor was the watch, or at least a member of it. You knew about this before coming here, he decided, studying her face. What is that makes this particular year different from the others? Timing, she quietly said. An opportunity that will not come twice. Tristan passed a hand through his hair, frustrated at how vague she was being but half sure it was not on purpose. She has called it an agreement, what stilled her tongue, and that implied someone on the other end of the bargain. It was not an oath, but a bargain struck with another. Someone who might care if she broke the terms. The Cryptia, he said. The masks, you said they wanted something from me. Do you know what it is? There were 100 names for the agents of the Cryptia, the most secretive of the Watch, and as many rumors for what their purpose might be. Spies and assassins, most said, though others claimed it was the Watchmen themselves they watched over. Whatever the truth, their reputation for ruthlessness and secrecy was no lie. It might not be a good thing at all that he had somehow drawn their eye. Mariam studied him for a long moment, blue eyes searching, before she let out a startled breath. So you really don't know, she quietly said. It's not something they want, Tristan, it's you. They are the circle that recommended you. Did that mean everyone who'd been recommended had? No, that wasn't as important as the fact that for some reason he had apparently caught the eye of the fucking masks. You're sure? He got out. Mariam leaned forward, openly worried. Tristan, the other recommended all had a name with them, she said. The person who gave the recommendation. All except you, yours was just a wax seal with the symbol of the Cryptia. I don't know how up their ranks you must be to be able to use that, but it's not low. She grimaced. You're telling me you have no idea who did this? I know who arranged for me to have a place on the Blue Belt, he admitted. But I could never be sure she was part of the Watch. She has never claimed so and I have never seen her in a black cloak. But how likely was Abuela to put one of those on, if she was truly part of the Cryptia? The rest of the Watch announced themselves, the black cloaks like a banner reminding everyone of what they stood for, but the masks were spies. The last thing they would want was to be announced. It could be she knows someone in the Cryptia, Mariam said, but she sounded doubtful. Maybe she called in an old favor. Old was the right word, for Abuela was at least nearing 70 for all that she remained spry. She could be retired, he thought. Could masks retire? He did not know. Tristan could feel his mind beginning to go in circles, picking away at all the many unknowns he had no way to shed light on, so he forced himself to keep speaking. Tell me about Songren. It was half a guess, come of details he had noticed in that bracing debate about who should get lynched for John's murder, but the rueful surprise on her face told him he'd struck true. I met her before the trials, Mariam said. She is here for the same reason I am. And what is that? He asked, knowing the answer he would get. Not something I can speak about without breaking my agreement, she replied. The special enrollment, he thought. That was the heart of the secret, for both she and Song. But in a way that was a disappointment, for that was a temporary addition to the greater secret of the Dominion of Lost Things. It would not help him unearth the truth of this place. How much do you really know about these trials? He quietly asked. More than I should, Mariam said, then grimaced. Less than you likely think. I can tell you that most people who contract with a maze god will get executed. I was specifically warned against it, and that the sanctuary past the ruins is a fort on the other side of the mountains. He raised an eyebrow, inviting her to continue. My source was vague on the trial of Grass, she admitted. But it is meant to rid the Watch of the reckless and troubled cases. Tristan bit at his thumb, thoughtful. First the relative shallowness of what she had said, juxtaposed with the emphasis made on certain details. If he had to bet, someone with full information had given her a broad outline and emphasized dangers that might get her killed. Has to be the Watch, he thought. Infant Zones wouldn't know anything about the third trial, or care about keeping whatever its purpose was intact. The easy guess for why the information she'd been given was vague. Good enough to help craft strategy, but not much beyond that. Second, he was now even more certain that the trial of ruins was the heart of this entire enterprise. Weeding out the reckless and the troubled cases? That sounded like filtering tacked on at the end of the road so that the blast cloaks would not be stuck with anyone that didn't truly want to enter their ranks. Which means the parts that matter are here and within the trial of lines, he thought. You're not interested in the maze at all, are you? Mariam suddenly said. I thought you might just be leveraging your reputation, holding out for a better offer by one of the groups, but it's not them your eye is on. I will have to go into the maze eventually, Tristan acknowledged. If nothing else, it would be the most expedient way to get rid of Cosmoflora and the Cherdans. He was not worried about being able to join later, given that after casualties began to mount all the diving crews would be looking for fresh blood. It would not make him liked, but what did he care for that? Still, it was through the gate he intended to pass this maze, and not the one the watch had told him to use. Yet keeping my attention on it strikes me as missing the canal for the barge, he continued. This place exists for a reason and this game is not it. That will be watch business, she warned him. Mine as well, so long as the watch demands I take part in this trial, Tristan replied. Mariam paced away, crossing her arms when she came to a halt. Light poured down from behind, gilding her silhouette as shadows obscured the lay of her face. You are not going to let this go. Neither of them pretended it had been a question. Through the shadows he met her eyes with his own, neither blinking. Are you? He challenged. What did the warnings help, when the Erevaton hunted us? You're in the same game as the rest of us, Mariam. Their secrets are just as likely to get you killed. For a long moment they remained that way, until finally she jerked her head to the side. There's another machine around, Mariam told him. It can be used to look at parts of the island on great panels of gold. It's how they make their reports, though supposedly there are limitations. We will have to be careful. She had said, and like that a weight left his shoulders. Mariam stepped away from the light, the gold sliding off her dress. It left the ghostly pit between them, painting the rubble. He saw the hesitation on her face but said nothing, letting her come to the decision to speak in her own time. Your surname, Mariam said. You keep it hidden for a reason. It was, he thought, gently done of her. If he simply answered yes the conversation would end there, but the door was opened if he wanted to say more. And it was tempting to simply put an end to it, but the thief held back on the impulse. She had, the day before their group tried the bridge, implied she might help him with his revenge. Tristan had just decided to dig at the watch's secrets because they might get him killed, which would make the hypocrisy of keeping Mariam in the dark a large one to swallow. Not so much he could not, but he found he did not want to. Not after all she had told him, even if those secrets were not her own. I cannot be certain, Tristan said, but I believe Cosmoflora might recognize the name of Brascal. It is uncommon? Mariam asked. Only somewhat, he said. But while we only met a handful of times when I was a child, he knew my father for 2 years. The blue-eyed woman slowly nodded. She did not ask, which perversely enough made him want to say more. He is at the bottom of my list for a reason, Tristan murmured. He pulled the trigger, in the end, but they'd killed my father long before that. House Cherden, she said. He nodded. Sacromonte is, he began, then halted. It was hard to explain to someone not of the city. We do not have a king, he said. And the Six, they are not different from other houses in principle. Most of their privileges are ceremonial. Yet it is the Six who rule us, have for as long as anyone can remember, and every noble house in Sacromonte craves to sit where they sit. He passed a hand through his hair. Only a few come close, Tristan said, and the Cherden are one of them. Only they can't seem to break in. Their blood is the right amount of old, they own enough land and make enough coin, but they don't have the something that lets the Six be on top, like contracts for the Archer, or the Veracity chambers for the Calzada. He thinly smiled. So they've been trying to bridge the gap, he said. Quietly, so the others don't notice, but quiet is just about the only line they drew in the sand. What did they do, Tristan? She quietly asked. He looked away, jaw clenching. Remembering how father had seemed so grateful when Cosm pulled the trigger. Too much for me to forgive, he said. They left it at that. Mariam snuck back ahead, at his suggestion, because Tristan was not yet done with the night. It was not back to his bedroll he went, but instead into the shadows of the old fort. And there, patiently waiting as he watched the movements of the patrols, he found out two things of some import. The first was Beatrice, coming out of the watch barracks and taking a short walk around the courtyard with an escort before returning within. Though she had a watchman with her, she did not seem a prisoner. Protection, Tristan thought. Unless he was quite wrong, Beatrice had withdrawn from the trials and no one else yet knew of it. The second came later, after he risked getting closer to the bastion with the astronomy equipment. It did not seem to be getting used, to his confusion, until his eye was drawn by a flash of lantern light. The bastion went slightly around the side of the great pillar, but it was high above that he saw the light, an opening in the stone, from which someone was lowered a rope ladder. He'd just found the other lieutenant in command of the garrison, Tristan decided, and why Lieutenant Wen had been so convinced none of them would see her. And with her he had found his first clue. Chapter 23. One more joined their number. Your Etsy was the last, approaching her on the evening when Tupac and Lord Icehound's crews went scouting ahead. The Aslan did not look any worse for the labors of the first trial, her tanned face without mark and her practical clothes, a sleeveless striped blouse above a long patchwork skirt, all of it under a thick sailor's coat, barely scuffed. The earrings dangling from her ears were of the same copper gold as Tupac's, but they were set with blue stones. They drew attention to her sultry dark eyes. Turquoise? Angharad asked, touching her ear as the other woman sat. Your Etsy looked surprised, even pleased. Indeed, she said. I was part of the Turquoise Society before leaving Eastleigh. Angharad cocked an eyebrow. I thought Eastleigh societies were named after animals, she said. Jaguars, eagles and the like. Warrior societies are, your Etsy corrected. Eastleigh cosmology separates the world into three spheres, one of which is war. As a diplomat I was part of the second sphere, culture, whose societies are named after precious stones. And the third? She curiously asked. Trade, your Etsy said. In the sense of occupation, not the mercantile, though that is also covered. It is the third sphere and the least, though still above Ox, the other, that which is not in the spheres. I will hazard a guess that this is where foreigners are counted, Angharad said. It is hardly our fault that they did not have the good sense to be born Eastleigh, she said, lips twitching. I can only apologize for the slight, the noblewoman gravely replied. I will forgive you this once, your Etsy allowed. It is a difference in philosophy, the way the societies are named. A warrior seeks to embody the strengths of their emblem, but that is a personal distinction. A cultural society is named after precious stone because we seek for our service to Eastleigh to be just as precious. That is admirable, Angharad said. One's honor is often found in service to that of others. It was the fundamental tenet of honor in the Isles, whose root was the High Queen. She was keeper of the honor of all Malin, its beginning and end, and could not die so long as the people of the Isles remained honorable. Mostly it teaches us to think differently than warrior society thugs, your Etsy said. There are only so many flower wars you can start before you're drowning in enemies instead of war prizes. I think our friend Master Xickle never quite learned that lesson. Angharad eyed her speculatively. But you did. I have spent much of my life learning to read people, the Aslan smiled. Which is why I can tell you with a degree of certainty that Shalini is one of the loveliest people you will ever meet, and also that if she suspects someone might be slight trouble for her Icehound she will fire a shot into the back of their head without batting an eye. Your Etsy's smile never wavered, though it pulled tight around the yes. A strong crew, those two have assembled, but until they have decided whether they are siblings or lovers I would much rather be part of yours, she said. It will do wonders for my nerves, if nothing else. Angharad choked, both at the glimpse into the private affairs of the Someshwari and the suddenness of the request. You can fight. She coughed out. Your Etsy stared flatly at her. My dear, she said, I was an Eastleigh diplomat. That was fair enough, and so their company added another. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing supplies and drilling basic formations at Angharad's insistence. For a crew that did not know their place would only trip each over each other in a storm. Or so Mother had always said. Come evening she was satisfied everyone had elementary understanding of each other's skill and would know where to stand when violence inevitably came knocking. Now all that was left was to venture out. Come morning the divisions had become clearly visible. 3 delving crews sat together for breakfast, and then the handful of spares who did not intend to venture out that day, Tristan, Sarah, Franco and Vanessa. Some off-color jests were made by Raymond about why Tristan and Sarah might want to stay behind with only dotards as witnesses, but they petered out in the face of her obvious disapproval. Save for that misstep, the mood was pleasant. Your Etsy got along well with the pair she had shared the trial of lines with, though she tread carefully around Zenzel, and while the air between Song and Isabel was yet frosty the Tianxi found much to speak about with Inyoni. That friendly air was shattered by Sergeant Mendissa, who made around at every table with a wooden crate full of what Angharad finally saw to be small iron lanterns. None larger than a fist, charming but quite identical. Some Tianxi workshop must make them in bulk. The sergeant showed them the small engraved circle inside where they must put at least a drop of their blood, about where a candle would be were this a real lantern. Angharad pricked her forearm with a knife and smudged a drop inside as instructed. Why a lantern? She asked Sergeant Mendissa. Same reason the 20 crowns used them, Lady Inyoni idly cut in. Angharad stared at her blankly, to the other woman's confusion. Have you never read the Empty Sea? She slowly asked. Ah, the noblewoman thought. That would explain it. It was the third of the great works, and from what she recalled only marginally more interesting than the Vainglory and its incomprehensible mythologies or the endless litany of deaths and disasters that was the Dead Shore. Angharad had stopped trying to read it after Father admitted that though it purported to recount how the nations of her ancestors had sailed away from the dying old world and journeyed to Vesper, it was a largely philosophical book about the nature of mankind and its reflections on the eponymous Empty Sea. Lots of finding islands where the lesson was that men were the real monsters all along, she'd heard. I began the works with the ships of Morin, she admitted. And ended them with the following work, The Madness of King Isay. She refrained from adding. That she had only read 2 of the 9 great works was occasionally a slight embarrassment. Can't blame her. I never read as anything half as depressing as The Dead Shore, Sergeant Mendissa shared. I've written up casualty lists that were more cheerful. But you did read it, that's the point, Inyoni grumbled. It is our common heritage, there's a reason it's mandatory. The grizzled older woman squinted at her. The 20 crowns, Lady Tredegar, our very own ancestors, she said with an accusatory pointed finger, found that our perceptions influence the other. We associate lanterns with sight, with finding things. And so, gods will be able to use them to get at you, Sergeant Mendissa completed. You know, for the eating. Both of her gave her odd looks at the choice of word. I was raised orthodox, they are not spirits to me, the sergeant informed them. It is your prerogative to be wrong, Inyoni conceded. Hey now. It is not her fault, she was never taught any better, Angharad excused. And I was going to give you hints about the maze, Mendissa said. Inyoni raised an eyebrow. Were you really? A moment passed. No, Mendissa confessed. Gods, it's like getting stared down by my own grandfather. Any moment now you'll be asking why I haven't found a husband yet. And why is that, young lady? Inyoni asked. Sergeant Mendissa shivered, called the whole affair eerie, and fled to another table. Angharad lost the war to keep her grin from showing, though she would admit she had not put up much of a fight. As breakfast slowly came to an end and it became clear that once more Beatrice would not be joining them, Angharad's lips thinned. Isabel had last evening admitted that she had not seen her maid in over a day, not even for meals, and that the watch had refused to answer her questions. Since she no longer slept in the old stables like the rest of them and her personal affairs appeared to have been removed, it was suspected that she slept in the barracks with the blast cloaks. Angharad sought and found Isabel's eye. As they were all at the same table, a common company, it was not breaking the oath she had given Raymond and must still heed. She may have retired from the trials, Angharad said. And not even asked me for leave? Isabel said, openly dubious. The barracks are also where the charming old woman was operated, so there must be a physician's office within. I expect she is simply sicker than anticipated. How much of that was genuine belief and how much was saving face at possibly having been abandoned by her handmaid Angharad could not tell, and now was not the time to plumb the depths of the question. Regardless, she is not to be counted among our company, she said. To that Isabel could only agree. They would be 8, them, and not 9. After everyone finished breaking the last of their fast, when her crew went to get their packs, Angharad found herself approached by a pair she had so far had little to do with, Lord Ishanner and Shalini Gul. Save their occasional cordial conversations on the Bluebell, they had hardly spent a minute together, so this was unlikely to be a social call. Movement drew her eye and she found Song, ready and armed, already on her way. Isabel was behind her, talking to Raymond with a faint air of irritation on her face. Pleased with the prompt reinforcement, Angharad turned to meet the Someshwari pair with a polite smile just as Song came to stand at her side, mirroring Shalini. Lady Angharad, Ishan greeted her. Lord Ishan, she replied. Good morning to you. And you, he easily said. He looked better now, not at all one orthovirus as he had the days before. The unpleasantness brought on by his contract must have passed. Shalini. Song. Their tones were strangely amused, given the banality of the situation. Were this another situation, Angharad would have engaged the others in small talk, as her station demanded, but they had more pressing duties to attend to. May I be of assistance to you, Lord Ishan? She asked. It occurred to me that while we will part ways later, the chubby-cheeked man said, we could journey to the shrines together. The tone was casual, the implied offer was not. Angharad decided to set it out plainly. Mutual defense against Tupac's group on the way seems agreeable, she said. And it would be diplomatic to keep some distance in order to avoid arguments. Zenzel Duma was a lord of Malin, he would no more break a truce than he would shoot a child out of the black, but temper were best left untested if possible. Brisk business, Shalini commented. We left our tea and silks at home, Song replied. They both ignored their seconds. Against Tupac's group or other third parties that are not the Watch, Lord Ishan counter-offered. And I would extend the same terms to a common return, should we leave the maze around the same time. Angharad could see the attraction in a common return, as they would be the most weak then, tired, wounded, possibly carrying corpses. The first part she hesitated about, for it was unpleasantly open-ended. Third parties could mean a great many things, even if their cooperation was limited to mutual defense. Third parties that were not intentionally provoked, Angharad finally specified. She would not let her crew be dragged into disputes like a reeve tricked into siding with some Uthukil clan. She had heard the stories, the reeve always ended up shot and then the clans promptly made a peace marriage so they could begin raiding their other neighbors for cattle instead. Being appointed a royal reeve on the Low Isle was not what a wise woman called a reward. Cautious, Shalini said. Last time my people weren't, it took 4 Cathayan wars to get you out. Savage, she praised. Angharad traded a look with Ishan, sharing in the kinship of being faintly embarrassed of the person they had brought along. They shook on it, as much to avoid more of that than because there was nothing left to quibble over. As they parted ways, the Perduri tried to look for what Etzi had mentioned, but mostly she saw that Shalini was protective of the men, which was hardly a revelation. She informed the others of the bargain struck as they assembled to move out, to mostly approval. Zenzel's face darkened, but even he saw the sense in a protection pact. They set out without further dallying, through openings in the ramparts at the back of the old fort. The Watch kept an eye on them from above as they moved across the rubble and onto the uneven bare rock of the cavern floor. It was not so smooth here as it had been before they entered the fort. Without lanterns and the pale golden glow from above, it would have been trouble to walk. Not only were there crevices and clumps, but also stretches of some sort of coppery moss that was highly slippery. Lord Ishan's crew was waiting ahead, nearly arrayed, while ahead of them both lanterns made it plain that Tupac Sickle and his 5 had taken the lead. The journey was uneventful, though the atmosphere was stilted from nerves and tension. It was about a quarter hour from the fort that the slope of broken shrines began, Lord Icehan informed her. After they left behind the great pillar the old fort was nestled against, it was largely open grounds between them and the ruins. Only a few jutting rocks, usually covered in that copper moss, broke up the barren landscape. The beginnings of the maze were not clear, for though every piece of this place had been built by men the place itself had not. Whatever haphazard spirit had seen fit to cast everything down in a pile cared not for gates and paths. Rubble and loose stones, sometimes entire slices of structures like arches and pillars, rose in a soft slope that inch by inch turned into a mountain within the mountain. So many temples and shrines and pavilions had been thrown atop one another that she could not tell where the ruins of one ended or began, leaving her with the impression that she truly was looking at a mountain. There were dozens of half-open shrines that might have served as a gate, Angharad saw, but only 3 whose entrance was open beyond the first few feet. The 3 shrines the watch had told them of, one marked by a lion, another a dove and the last a serpent. Tupac's crew was already slipping in the narrow crevice between 2 walls along which a broken mural of a serpent slithered. It felt a little on the nose for the Estland to choose the serpent shrine, in all honesty. Her musings were interrupted by Lord Icehan, who offered her his hand to shake. She did. "We explored the lion shrine yesterday," the dark-eyed man said. "We will again today." "Good luck," Angharad replied. "And you?" Theirs was, then, to be the dove shrine. It was in the middle of the 3 between a painted and sculpted arch to the left, adorned by roaring lion head, and the narrow winding path that Tupac was leading his fellows through. The way into their own shrine was broad stairs half covered in dust and rubble, going up 20 feet into a collapsed arch, which would easily be climbed over, leading into yawning open gates whose sides were covered with intricate bronzes of doves at play. A hall continued into what she thought might be the shrine proper, while above the gate the mountain of ruins continued to rise. A mere half a foot above a column had toppled backwards, stuck between 2 laughing monkey statues, and above those heads was a window where a yellow light trembled that, Angharad shook her head. She could spend a lifetime finding new paths here and barely scratch the surface. She would have to trust in the explorations of the watch. She turned to glance back at her company, finding it grim-faced and ready. "Forward," she simply said. "Let us see what the shrine has in store for us." The stone here was unsettlingly dry, she noticed, not at all like the natural cavern floor they had walked on. It was as if the spirits of this place had licked up even the dew. Though Angharad went forward with a lantern, after passing the broken arch and entering the hallway she found it was hardly needed. Lights burned on the walls at regular intervals, small trembling flames inside eggs of glass. It was surprisingly beautiful, especially when the light shone along the edge of the bronze reliefs adorning the walls. They showed feathers, the Perdiri thought, though some of them bent folded strangely. They went down the corridor into a larger chamber, whose dusty floor was touched with old footsteps. The watch, she decided. A flicker of movement at the corner of her eye had Angharad reaching for her new blade, a solid saber that was not at fault for not being the sort she wanted, but when she looked it was only an empty glass egg in a corner. The bare stone of this place was unsettling, so she pressed on without waiting longer. This was, the Perdiri knew within a heartbeat of entering, the heart of the Dove Shrine. The chamber was the largest yet, at least 30 feet wide and as long, with elaborate decorations. The first few feet of the floor were bare stone, but beyond that a tiled floor in blue and bronze led all the way to another bare stretch and a cramped door at the back, but it was the walls that drew the eye. They were covered in dizzying murals of bronze tiles, painted so that great swirls of dark colors would envelop eyes and feathers, and exquisite perches of bronze extended at irregular intervals. Angharad moved aside from the entrance but was careful to stay on the bare stone. The spirit of this shrine would reveal themselves soon enough. The only way out of this room seemed to lead into a much smaller chamber, perhaps the way out. Her instincts told true. The moment the last of them, Zenzel, entered there was a small flutter. 8 pairs of eyes turned to the same perch, where the spirit had deigned to reveal itself. It looked like a dove, But now finally Angharad understood the strange gilding from earlier. Every single feather was made of intricately folded paper, patterns within patterns, and she was careful not to look at them too long. If the powerful storm painted on the mural was any hint, there may be danger in staring. The dove spirit flicked its paper feathers, eerily bird-like. "Supplicants," it spoke in a voice like fluttering paper, "you enter the shrine of." Angharad winced. That had not been a word, at least not in a way a woman's ears could hear. Her companion seemed to have fared no better. "By ancient accord," the dove spirit continued, "for a wager you may take my trial and win rite of passage." "And what is to be your trial, spirit?" Lady Inyani called out. The dove rustled with anger, paper feathers inflating. Spirits often enjoyed the unearned deference that was being called a god, but Inyani had done no wrong. The sole god was the sleeping god, they who would one day wake. "Cross the tiles of my shrine," it said, without standing on water. Angharad eyed the tiles, seeing no water. Did it mean the blue tiles instead of the bronze? That would be easy enough since they alternated, which meant there was likely some sort of trap. Given how singularly well-suited her contract was to avoid making such a mistake, however, it was nothing glimpses ahead would not see her through. Then she ought to begin. It would be a good example, besides. Only before Angharad could so much as say a word she was interrupted. "Let me," Isabel said, stepping forward. Surprise, Angharad's among them. "There is no need to," she began, but the dark-haired beauty shook her head. "There is," she replied. "I am not unaware that my skill at arms is lacking compared to most here. I must then be ready to risk my life on tests of cleverness to compensate. It is only fitting." There were many approving faces at that, enough that Angharad curbed her instinct to insist that someone else should take the very first trial. It would be disrespect twice over, first of Isabel herself, who was acting with honor, and then of everyone else in this crew for implying that their lives were not of equal worth. She kept her worry off her face. "Be careful," she said instead. "Of course, darling," Isabel smiled back. She then stepped forward, gathering her skirts, and approached the edge of the tiles straight-backed. "God of the land, I ask you for terms," she called out. The dove spirit shuffled on its perch, what looked like feathers shivering at first glance in truth an intricate dance of paper folding and unfolding. "I already gave them," the spirit replied, its voice like pages being strummed. "Then there will be no imposition in speaking them anew," Isabel firmly insisted. The spirit flicked its paper feathers irritably, likely irked at having been robbed of starting another game entirely without telling anyone. "There are 64 tiles on this floor," the dove spirit said. "You must cross from one side to another without ever standing on water or leaving the tiles." "God of the land, I would accept these terms," Isabel said. "I offer for my wager this lantern." She presented the small iron lantern touched with a drop of her blood. "What offer you in return?" "Peaceful passage unhindered through my shrine for all who stand in this room," the dove spirit said. "Until your death." "God of the land," Isabel replied, bowing respectfully, "I accept these terms and wagers." "Then you may undertake my test," the spirit allowed. "Begin." Only Isabel did not immediately step onto one of the tiles. Instead she went looking through the bag she had carried, taking out a long and thin rod of metal, almost like a hollow fishing rod. The dark-haired beauty paced along the length of the tiles as everyone made room for her, eyes considering, before she pressed the tip of the metal rod on a blue tile, the fourth from the left on the first row. After nothing happened, she stepped onto the tile. Angharad's heart stammered, but after a long moment it became plain Isabel was safe. Methodically, Isabel began prodding other tiles. Angharad was not sure of the rhyme or reason to it, for she tried not only tiles ahead of her but also the one to her left, only for that one to immediately crumple. Like a flower closing, the thin covering of paper of the tile bunched up and revealed the painted river underneath. Several of them breathed in sharply. There was the mentioned water. "No supplicant you," the dove spirit hissed, its voice like paper ripping. "Thief, thief, 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 thief." Halfway across the board, one of the tiles shivered. In the heartbeat that followed, it was no longer a tile but a gaping hole of shimmering darkness. Gloom, Angharad realized. A pit of gloom. Nothing but death could come of stepping into that. It never promised to leave all the tiles, Lord Zenzel noted. We should have thought of that. It is angry, Song evenly replied. And might never have acted such had Lady Isabel not been so obviously forewarned of this test. It was, Angharad admitted, likely she had been. The blind groping around seemed instead to have been Isabel looking for a particular pattern. Perhaps there were several and she was trying to find out which she was dealing with. Certainly, after moving twice in a diagonal to the right and revealing 2 more paper tiles, she moved with much more certainty. Only the dove spirit was angry, hissing its spiteful accusation of thief as it sowed another gloom pit every minute or so. It was trying to box her in the corner, cut her path across, but though Isabel's slightly shaking hands revealed fear, her eyes were steady. It took bravery to take such a test, Angharad thought, even forewarned. Unlike her, the Infanzona had never been trained for peril. It was rather attractive to see that Isabel Ruesta was the kind of woman capable of gambling with her life, if it came to it. For all the dove spirit's anger, its tricks and tests were no match for the stratagem plied against them. Within 10 minutes Isabel set foot on the bare stone, victorious in the challenge posed to her. All eyes turned to the spirit, whose spitting anger was no great augury. "Thief you are," it screeched, paper twisted and bent. "Thief and victor. Get out of my sight." They hurried across, careful to avoid the lingering pits of gloom, which the spirit pointedly did not remove. Isabel's nerves were soothed by the time Angharad joined her, but her cheeks were still fetchingly reddened. There were some congratulations from the others as they left the large chamber for the smaller one behind it, little more than a dark room with a large bronze dove within it, which all took care not to touch. It felt like the idol of the shrine. Beyond that, a hole in the wall led into a slice of golden light, a small barren garden where the glow from above cast shadows on the dusty ground. They all breathed easier out there, away from the spirit and its anger at being beaten. The garden was quite petty, for all that it was desolate and the earth covered in a layer of dust, but as they took the time to look around, Angharad found why it was the watch called this place a maze. There were easily 3 paths they could take, perhaps 4. On the other side of the garden, beyond an elegant arrangement of stones, a short, curved bridge over a deep crevice led into what must be another shrine. To their left a slender path circled around what looked to be a forest of columns jutting out from a raised temple ground, while to their right a large slice of toppled stairs served as the first of a series of platforms to climb past the garden wall to what looked like a winding path. The columns looked like the path that most advances, Raymond Sheridan pointed out. He had been quiet today, almost withdrawn. It was unlike him, but then he was surrounded by strangers that were not beholden to him. Master Cosm had not left his side even once. It also looks like a larger temple, Inyani told him. Could mean a stronger spirit. If we take a test every 100 feet, none of us will live to reach the gate on the other side of this cavern, Song noted, so I would argue against the shrine beyond the bridge. Agreed, Zenzel grunted. Unless Lady Ruesta's luck would extend there as well. Isabel shook her head. I have never heard of this garden, she said. The end of the Dove Shrine was described to me as a large courtyard with collapsed sections revealing tunnels. It would not be much of a maze if it could so easily be mapped, Master Cosm said. Lady Tredegar, your opinion? The broken stairs intrigue, she admitted. It seems to be that from up there we may well see the temple grounds anyhow, so come worst we could advance there better informed. It is the most difficult path, Raymond Sheridan objected. If any of us should miss a jump. Sweat is good for the soul, Lord Raymond, Inyani snorted. I agree with Lady Tredegar. Most, if not all, did. They set out for the path to the right. Climbing atop the toppled slice of stairs was not difficult, neither was the leap atop what looked like the roof of a ruined stone gazebo. From that roof to the top of a remarkably fat column was trickier, given the smaller size of where they might leap. But after Angharad stayed behind to help Yuretsi make the jump, the others followed suit, and their company was lucky enough no one fell. The Perduri was not certain the height would be enough to break a leg, unless one fell at a very bad angle, but it certainly would have hurt. The edge of the garden wall was the last jump, going into a slightly lower stripe of tiled roof that swiftly got covered by the edge of a collapsed rotunda. It was easy enough, if you were careful not to slip on the tiles, and after that the path needed no jumping at all. They circled around the edge of the rotunda, seeing the temple under it and worrisome flickering lights, before climbing up an angled walkway past a series of arches. It seemed it had cut above many trials, which was good news if they could find a way down. Unfortunately, the paths kept going up. They doubled back after stairs heading down led to a barred iron gate, then shimmied along the side of Ziggurat while strange shapes prowled in the too pale grass below. Yet for all that they kept rising, they also kept advancing, and without Tess. Their luck came at an end when the fallen but whole aqueduct they were using as a road crossed a gap to bring them straight at an open gate, flanked by two waterfalls with no other path in sight. They gathered near the gate. It was pitch black inside, and shuffled awkwardly. It must have been at least an hour and change since they took the first test. It felt as if they had begun anew. Nowhere to go but forward, it seems, Sung muttered. I wouldn't say that, Lady Inyani replied. She was, Angharad saw when she turned, kneeling by the waterfall to the left. The current is weak and the water shallow, the older woman told them. We could get around the test through the waterway, if we are not afraid to get wet. There was some debate, but at the end of the day they preferred shuffling leg high in the wet with their bags held above their heads than trying their luck with another spirit. It was as exhausting to wade in the water, even against so light a current, but the dimly lit waterway eventually led to a luminous series of pools nestled between shrine walls so high they might as well have been cliffs. The water was deeper in the pools, so they kept to the sides, and it looked like a dead end until Song found handholds carved in the side of a cliff. They led about 20 feet up, to a cleverly hidden nook that was the entrance to a tunnel. There was not much space up there, so after Angharad and Zenzel joined Song there they had to shout down to talk with the others. Song was convinced the tunnel was not a god's lair, insisting there was no shrine mark, and she was convincing enough the others agreed. It helped that no one wanted to go back through the waterway if they could help it. The tunnel turned sharply to the left through what felt like solid stone, eventually reaching open air and revealing a large domed temple in the distance, atop series of airy stairs. To get there, however, they must make their way along a thin ledge that faced an elegant red mosaic on one side and a precipitous drop on the other. Looking down, Angharad saw only mist and the sound of distant water. It did not look like a fall one would survive. It does not seem impossible, if we take our time, Raymond Sheridan said. There is space between the stone and the mosaic to hold on. Taking a second look, Angharad saw he was right. More than enough to hold on to the top of the mosaic. The Infanzon did not offer to make handholds with his contract and she did not ask. There was not yet a true need to reveal the details of his power, not with an alternative at hand. It would be a waste to turn around now, Lord Zenzel agreed. We are almost a third of the way through, I believe. Even if we cover only half as many grounds this afternoon, at this pace by tomorrow we would have a path to the end of the maze. There was some excitement at that idea. If they had a path, well, the need for 10 victors could be seen to more leisurely. They could choose the tests undertaken, aim for those giving the best chances of survival. With most in agreement, they got to crossing. Only Song seemed less enthusiastic, and Angharad held back to speak with her. Nothing practical, the Tianxi told her before she could even ask. It's the mosaic that trips me. It clearly was part of a shrine at some point, but it no longer is. The watch mentioned some of the shrine spirits die, Angharad reminded her. That is a dangerous thing, Angharad, Song murmured. When a god returns formless to the ether, they leave behind an impression of themselves. It is rarely a kind thing. The Perduri was tempted to dismiss this as Republican superstition, but Song had earned better than such talk. I will keep an eye out, she promised. For once she chose to stay in the middle of the company instead of taking the lead, before Zenzel and behind Yuretsi. Rising on the tip of her toes, she took a look at the space above the mosaic, but it was empty save for old dust. She still kept a firm hand on her contract, pulling at a glimpse before she began moving across. Nothing. Again when Anthony had crossed all the way, Isabel right behind her, but still nothing. Once more, she told herself when halfway through, and teeth and claws and a blood-curdling scream, between Yuretsu's hands, and she slipped. She was already moving by the time the spirit popped out, catching Yuretsu by the collar of her coat and forcefully pressing her against the mosaic as she trembled. "Steady," Angharade shouted over the screaming thing. "Remember, it cannot directly hurt us." It was not even touching Yuretsu's hands. She saw its claws carefully avoiding any contact. "Lords," Yuretsu gasped, shivering as she clutched the stone. "Oh, lords." Angharade's eye stayed on the spirit, whose screeching began to lower in pitch. It looked like a hound eaten up by wriggling worms, half rotten, but the worms did not move and neither did its eyes. After a few seconds the screeching cut out entirely and the creature went still as a stone. That is not a living spirit, Angharade thought. It was not as aware or complete. After another few heartbeats it began to crumble from the inside, collapsing into clumps of dust. The stink of them was atrocious, like a rotten corpse. The noblewoman cast glimpses ahead a few more times as they crossed, but there was no second ambush. They made it across without deaths. The other side was a broad walkway leading up into the airy stairs they had seen earlier. At the end of the steps stood a large domed temple, whose crumbling stone gates were cracked open. Though they were surrounded on all sides by walls so high as to feel as cliffs, there was a sense of open air to the walkway, helped along by the golden light falling from above, that she found enjoyable. She was not alone in that opinion. When Angharade suggested they stop for a meal, as it should be nearing noon, the notion was popular. After that excitement during the crossing, all could use the time to settle their nerves. The fare obtained from the watch was simple but filling, but there was little conversation. The looming silhouette of the temple was too stark a reminder of what they must soon do. When they set out, Angharade felt sharper for the rest, taking the lead as her crew began climbing the stairs. This particular temple, she saw, was not so ruined as others they had crossed. At the top of the stairs the entrance boasted a floor of elegant turquoise patterns. She shared an amused glance with Yuretsu at the coincidence, and though the gates were broken the antechamber beyond them was a splendid thing. The walls were tiles of moonstone and serpentine, touched with streaks of gold and iron as if someone had painted with the liquid metals. Age and use had worn a slight groove in the floor that led out into a massive chamber, at the threshold of which Angharade cautiously slowed. Isabel, right behind her, softly gasped at the sights. Not without reason. The temple was as a single-segmented chamber under the great dome they had seen from outside. A polished black marble floor, so polished it seemed to mirror, reflected the exquisite insides of the dome above, a riot of ticking golden gears as an enormous clock. The machinery there connected to the lower chamber on golden threads and pulleys, 100 mechanisms of gold and iron moving in a strangely harmonious disharmony. Several of the machines on the ground were so large they effectively segmented the room, casting moving shadows on the marble as golden lanterns whirled above. Not a single part of it made a sound. Angharade slowly stepped onto the marble floor, others following behind. "Well, Lady Inyani said, at least there's no need to ask where the spirit is." She followed the other woman's gaze and found that, in her study of the room, she had somehow missed the silhouette sitting cross-legged at the center of it all. It looked like a man, at first glance, but only that, for though the contour of the silhouette was perfect, the inside was a madness of copper, gears and wheels and twitching pistons. "Welcome," the spirit said, voice like ringing brass. It seemed much friendlier than the last, so Angharade returned the manners in kind. "We thank you for your welcome, honored elder," she said. The spirit twitched, though there was nothing animal about. It twitched like a clock losing a gear, a carriage tumbling off the road. "Manners," the spirit said, surprised. It has been long. There were no eyes inside the silhouette, but somehow she felt the weight of its attention anyway. She came no closer, for politeness did not mean harmlessness, and the others stayed close but behind the invisible line her presence had drawn. "You seek to cross my temple, yes," the spirit said. "This can be done, but there must be a test." "I would hear the terms of it," "Honored elder," Angharad said. The clockwork spirit twitched again, but this time there was a grinding metal sound and it spit out something. A small golden gear tumbled against the floor, rolling until came at a halt. "Everything," the spirit said, "must be measured. Must be earned. 2 or more, hold my gear for the agreed amount of time." Angharad frowned. That sounded much too simple. It twitched. "And live to the end," the spirit added. "Victory so long as one survives." It was with a fresh eye that Angharad considered the machinery all around them. She now grasped that every part might be used to try and kill her. The Perduri politely asked for clarification, learning from the spirit that the more of them agreed to take the trial, the shorter the time that must be survived would be. Time where the gear was not being held by a living participant would not count towards the total. For all its friendliness, she thought, it was looking to feed. "Manners," the spirit approvingly repeated. "I will give reward, good terms. Only they who hold the gear will be in direct peril." Angharad blinked in surprise, thanking the spirit before going to confer with the others. Opinions varied. "Best to go around, I say," Raymond Sheridan said. "It is a large temple and not so ruined, which I cannot trust. If we do not go through here, we may well have to go back through the waterway to find another path," Zenzel said. "I will not say the test is without risks, but which would be? We will have to take one sooner or later. We can choose who goes in," Koz mused, stroking his beard. "It makes the business more manageable, I agree. I would rather take another swim than try this," Your Etzi frankly said. "Never trust a well-fed god. It seems a test of skill," Inyani noted. "Dangerous, yes, but in some ways the fairest kind we may undertake." The split was slightly in favor of the attempt. 2 against 3-4. Isabel desisted from expressing an opinion since she would not be taking the test, saying it would be unseemly, and it left Song as well as Angharad herself. The two shared a look, Song grimacing but not advising against. Dangerous, then, but not impossible to her all-too-seeing silver eyes. "Let us attempt it," she said. "Volunteers only." That Angharad should participate was not in doubt, and neither were Zenzel and Inyani's addition. Master Kozm received Remon's hesitant permission, but Your Etzi was the true surprise. The Aslan shrugged at her inquiring look. "If it must be done, then I would tilt the odds in our favor as much as I can," she said. Angharad smiled back, charmed by the sentiment. She was rather pleased Your Etzi had joined their crew. 5 of them would need to survive 5 minutes, beginning the moment one of them picked up the golden gear from the ground. The Perduri cautiously made certain that the lanterns illuminating the temple would not be snuffed out, which the spirit agreed to speak in the terms. It was, for all its hunger, inclined to fair play. The wager was simple enough: there would be no lantern on the line and a victory would grant all present safe passage across the temple until all who took the trial were dead. Though 5 would participate, only the individual holding the gear when the test ended would be considered a victor. "Let us make sure the minutes mentioned are the same we know," Inyani prudently suggested. The spirit proved this, counting 1 with them and agreeing that all minutes would be the same length. With that last precaution out of the way, Angharad agreed to the terms. "Good," the spirit said, twitching. "Begin when you would." But instead of moving, she remained frozen. For a moment, when the spirit had twitched, she had thought she glimpsed something inside its neck. Teeth and red flesh, swallowing. Only she saw nothing of it now, only the clockwork spirit, and she ignored the beating of her heart. Staring too long at spirits was never for the best. She had volunteered to be the one to first take the gear, so she slowly approached it. Slowly enough she could risk more than a glimpse. Angharad thought of dark waters, of the coolness enveloping her, and sunk deep. Angharad treading her picked up the gear and the chamber came alive. A forest of cylinders rose from the seamless floor, golden edges like blades turning so quick they were a blur, and a tapestry of golden thread twitched above. Scythes began to fall like pendulums. Sharp wheels shot forward, and though Angharad danced across the danger, she was cornered. She passed the gear to Inyani after a minute, but the spirit had been methodical. It was cornering them, leaving obstacles in the way. Inyoni passed to Zenzel to avoid a narrow death, who took 3 steps before he was crushed by a weight. Etsy lost her head trying to take the gear from his corpse, and she broke the foresight and let out a wet gasp, body shivering as if she had been drenched in ice. She could feel wetness against her eyes but knew it was not tears. Discreetly as she could, she wiped the beads of blood before they could trail down. A flex of her power told her she could still glimpse, but that already she was nearing her limit for the day. It had been worth it to learn that the spirit was not only using the machines but would be leaving them there. Every attack on her was an obstacle afterwards, and it would be very easy to get cornered were she not careful. "Ready?" she called out. "Ready," Inyoni shouted back. She took the gear. By the time her back straightened, the clockwork spirit was gone and the whirling golden blades rising from the mirror-like floor. Breathing out, ignoring the shouts of surprise from her allies, Angharad kept an eye on the machinery around her. A twitch of thread told her the scythe would be coming down a heartbeat before it did, but instead of fleeing she stepped behind one of the risen cylinders. The golden scythe from the ceiling slammed into the whirling blades, the 2 traps scrapping each other with cacophonous noise. A glimpse told her it would be the wheels next. Some kind of clockwork engine on the other side of the chamber twitched, shooting out a sharp iron wheel towards her, and then similar machines did the same from 3 other sides. "Steady," Angharad murmured. The longer she stayed in the center, the harder it would be for the spirit to corner them. Like in her vision, the purpose of the wheels was to force her to leave cover, and the moment she stepped away from the scrapped cylinder, scythes began to fall one after another. Left, she caught as she stepped around a spinning wheel and a blade filled the space between 2 whirling cylinders. Right, she saw as a pulley tightened and a bar of solid iron swung through where she had just been standing, rising back up to the ceiling as the arc went all the way through. A cylinder unlatched itself from its base and wildly went spinning, lethal golden blades scrapping at the floor, and as Angharad fled back towards space filled by a scythe, she realized she had been caught. Above her a large mass of gold was being aligned, enough to crush twice over. Thankfully, the others were not far. She chose her successor. "Zenzel," she shouted, and threw the gear. The Milani lord almost fumbled the catch, but caught it against his coat. His aunt stayed close, ready to bail him out at moment's notice, while Angharad breathed in relief and circled around. The test had gone on long enough. All had noticed the danger of letting yourself be driven into a corner, so the grisly ants she had seen need not come about. Master Kozm had prudently moved around the scrapyard she had made in the center, positioning himself to have much ground to give when his turn came, so it was Etsy that Angharad came close to. She was counting under her breath. Over halfway there, the Aslan told her. They stayed together for a while longer, as Zenzel struggled and passed the gear to his aunt, who promptly passed it back to the better-prepared Kozma floor. There the spirit struck relentlessly, smashing weights and pistons and scythes after the soldier with a fury Angharad never not seen even in the vision. It wanted a kill. Pieces of machinery went flying, another danger to keep an eye for. She had to pull back Etsy when a broken piece of wheel almost took her in the side, though the Aslan fumbled on her feet and almost tripped her into a spinning cylinder. "Careful," Angharad chided, studying them both. "Sorry," the diplomat murmured. "This is out of my experiences." "You and I both," she thought. Kozm saw his death right ahead, so he passed the gear back to Inyoni. Etsy, perhaps shamed by the fresh mistake, darted close so the older woman could toss it. She broke into a run, scythes falling in her wake, and as they all felt the trial coming to a close they neared the corner where it would all end. The spirit lost all subtlety, dropping weights not to kill but to close off paths, and Etsy handed the gear to Zenzel. Angharad staked out good open grounds to finish the last of the time, then dipped close to the Milani. Only he did not pass it, did not have the time to look for that. All 4 of the cylinders around him unlatched in quick succession, at the right moment in the spin to converge towards him. Angharad cursed, unsheathing and striking at the closest but finding herself too weak to even slow it. Yet Zenzel, impossibly, threw himself down between whirling blades and emerged with only his coat and back cut up as the cylinders violently collided. Already a weight was being aligned above, but his aunt stole the gear out of his extended hand and stepped away. 10, you're it, he shouted. They had it, Angharad saw. Inyani had an open stretch ahead of her, leading straight into a corner, but so long as she did not run too quickly, and the cylinders around her stopped. Angharad glimpsed ahead, ignoring the heat in her veins, but it was a second too late. Duck, she shouted. Inyani tried. But every golden blade set in the cylinder came flying out, like a spray of shrapnel, and she could not avoid them all. 2 in the leg, 1 in the torso, and still Angharad held out hope until the older woman stumbled back and fell, revealing the golden blade splitting her skull in half, dug deep between her eyebrows. The corpse toppled down less than a foot again from Zenzel, bloodied and weeping, whose hand clawed as his aunt. He ripped the gear out of her hand, and a heartbeat later machines went still. The test had come to an end, Zenzel Duma its victor. After, when the grief and the recriminations and the weeping had ebbed low, they gathered themselves and began the trek back to the old fort, carrying Inyani's mangled corpse. Thus ended Angharad's first effort against the Trial of Ruins Chapter 24. So? Vanessa frowned down at the papers with the gate mechanisms drawn on them, idly picking at the edge of her missing eye wound. Mariam was a deft hand with charcoal. It is not a lock, the clockmaker said. It is much too complex for that. That it is a machine is not in doubt, but the manner of machinery it is trips me up. Tristan, crouched at her side, hummed as he glanced at the papers. He'd taken looks at Mariam's drawings as well but gotten little out of it. He was a lockpicker. This was several miles past his area of expertise. Why? The old woman bent over as she leant on her crutches, letting out a small hiss of pain, and tapped the set of metal tiles above the center of the gate. See these? She said. Their surroundings are full of cogs that would move only if we press the tiles, not unlike an elaborate combination lock, but the section does not connect to most of the mechanisms on rest of the gate. So we are not seeing the whole mechanism? He ventured. Almost certainly, she said. I believe that, under all the misdirection, the gate is best understood as 3 concentric circles. She tapped the tiles again. First this section, whose tiles will require pressing. She then drew a finger in a vague vertical oval shape around the tiles. Then this area, which has the most moving parts but no obvious trigger or purpose, my guess is that it connects to something unseen, possibly an etheric engine. To end she drew a circle that swallowed up most of the gate, near the edges. We end with a broad ring that bears an underlying circular structure. I should be able to make it rotate when I grasp what makes it move, Vanessa mused. It is not a puzzle, Tristan, because the machinery is clearly meant to have some continuous movement. Yet neither is it akin to a clock, it does not seem to be using a fixed unit of measurement. And if you had to guess what the mechanisms do, all used together. Tristan pressed. Whatever it is those tiles decide it should, Vanessa replied without batting an eye, moving her finger back to them. Beyond that I could not say without having a look at the hidden parts. She paused. If you lend me Saria's eyes and legs, Vanessa added, I think I could make out the purpose of the outer ring. It is after that we shall hit a dead end. I will ask her, Tristan said. As for the dead end, let me worry about it. He had already begun planning how to get up in the pillar, through that opening he had glimpsed last night. The hidden parts that Vanessa was thinking of must be in there. Movement caught his attention, revealing that Mariam and Francho had returned from their belated walk to the shrines, so he parted ways with the old woman. He met Mariam halfway as the old professor kept going, leaving the 2 of them behind. Any trouble? He asked. There is not a soul out there, everyone is in the maze, Mariam told him. It was safe enough, though it would be wise not to let him go unescorted anyhow. Agreed, Tristan said. And thanks. He is an interesting man and free with conversation, she shrugged. It was not much of an imposition. Thanks anyhow, the thief said. Vanessa would have your help, if you are willing to lend it. Progress on the gate? Mariam asked. She believes with your help there could be, Tristan said. Though I will need to venture in a few dark corners before we get our full answers, I think. Work suited to your nature, the blue-eyed woman really said. You are a natural skulker, Tristan. That is most unkind of you, he gravely replied. A B. I took me years to learn such splendid manners of skulking. Do not discredit my efforts. Mariam's lips twitched, as did his own. They parted ways without need for anything more, brushing elbows as they went in opposite directions. Franco, looking tired but beaming, had obtained a cup of water and was dutifully sipping at it on one of the kitchen tables. Tristan joined him. You look in a fine mood, the thief observed. I have found answers, the professor said. That is always a fine thing. You have willing ears as well, should you be inclined share, Tristan easily replied. The old man nodded, eyes bright. As we suspected, my young friend, it was the antediluvians that built this place, Franco said. That is, the earliest parts of it. The iron gate and the pillar, Tristan guessed. And the great golden machine above, though that was not in doubt. Who else could build the likes of that? The old man nodded, sipping at his cup. My surprise, the professor said, was in learning it was not men who built the maze and fort. The thief breathed in sharply. You mean the watch didn't bring in all these shrines? Oh no, the toothless old man grinned. This is much, much older than the Iscariot Accords. The shrine adorned with a lion head, for example, was brought here during what I believe to be the Century of Loss. Tristan counted in his head. The Accords were signed in 81 steel, so that was all of Loss and crowns on top of those 81 years. Almost 3 centuries from a date that was now over 3 centuries ago. The thief's brow rose. Darklings built this? He asked. It was not impossible, he supposed. Hollows were hardly incapable of great works, for all that they tended to be decades, if not more, behind the great powers of Vesper. The Century of Loss was not so long after the collapse of the Second Empire either. They would still have wielded some old wonders. Devils built this, Franco corrected. He broke out into a wet cough, leaving Tristan to digest the strangeness of what he had just heard. Devils? They were months away from Pandemonium by sail, and though Hell was hardly the only dwelling place of their kind, Pandemonium was their only city. But then the maze was not meant to be inhabited, was it? This was merely a kind of outpost, not so uncommon a thing. Both the fort and the maze? The fort all at once, from what I can hear, but the maze is the work of centuries, Franco said. And then the watch took it over, Tristan muttered. Why? Why build this place, and why take it? A fascinating mystery, the old professor enthusiastically said. I cannot make out devils' voices as clearly as men's, especially the young, but I do believe further journeys to the maze will yield some answers. I will be getting word about what lies deeper inside it from of our friends, Tristan said, absent-mindedly nodding. That too should be of use. I shall look forward to it, Franco cheerfully said. He left the old man to his rest. It would be hours yet before the maze crews returned, but Tristan did not have time to idle. He had plans for tonight, but to be feasible they first required the old fort to be cased. The blast cloaks were generally disinclined to let him onto the ramparts, but after some wheedling a sergeant let him under escort for a minute or two. He had not gotten anywhere near the parts of the fort that were off-limits, the barracks, supply depot and northwestern bastion, but now he had a decent idea of where the patrols on the walls would be looking from. There were quite a few dead angles, if you timed yourself right, which he could. That was the downside of patrolling carrying lanterns, anyone could see you coming. Getting to the bastion stairs should not be all that difficult, given how many nooks and crannies to hide and he had already found, but once on the stairs it would be difficult. There was always a guard on the wall above the stairs, and even if he snuck up onto the bastion there was no cover there, he could be seen from all over the fort. Snuffing out the lanterns was usually his answer to that sort of thing, but this was not the Merc and these weren't bored street toughs. If a lantern went out, the watch would go there and look. Besides, there is no way for me to get up that rope ladder quickly enough that I would not be noticed. Which was a problem, since up that ladder was where he needed to go. Make a distraction, Fortuna suggested. Like fire. You always suggest fire, he complained. What are you the goddess of again? Second-rate thieves, apparently, the Lady of Long Odds savagely replied. Tristan mimicked taking an arrow to the heart. to her peal of laughter. Her plan would not work for the same reason that snuffing out the lanterns would not. These were professionals. If he made a mess, the section of the fort they wanted to keep hidden was the very first part they would lock down. Her suggestion was useful, however, in a way he had learned to cultivate as a child: always consider the very opposite of what Fortuna was advising. Go loudly, using the ladder would thus become go quietly, not using the ladder. He stared at the pillar, then swallowed. "You look a little sick," Fortuna noted. "Remember when we robbed that printer who'd walled himself in?" He murmured, feigning a yawn. Gods, the smell. He would never forget that. The golden-eyed goddess looked gleeful. "You almost knocked yourself out on a gargoyle climbing the tower," Fortuna remembered with relish. "This is going to be worse," Tristan sighed. Having a closer look at the massive pillar the gate was set in only confirmed his fears. Prying at it with a knife revealed that the surface only looked perfectly smooth because the building stones were covered in a thin layer of that First Empire plaster that didn't decay, the same from the Alfonsan baths in Old Town, which stayed pretty no matter how many times they had to wash graffiti off it. It was good news, because that ancient plaster was no harder than the imitations Vesper had since come up with. Picking at the stone beneath, he found that the almost seamless junctures had a little give. Wall hammers and some spikes might be enough, then. The trouble would be how to get them without making it obvious. He went to find Sergeant Mendissa, the tall Milani that was charged with care of the trial takers, but she was nowhere in sight. When he asked the watchman, he instead found himself dragged before her superior. Lieutenant Wen was eating again, some sort of jerky button that even the Tianxi's perfect pearly white teeth seemed to be struggling with. "I'm not sharing, so stop staring," the lieutenant bluntly told him. "What do you want Mendissa for?" "I would like a look through the supplies," Tristan said. The lieutenant glanced at his clothes, a long-sleeved black tunic that stopped above his knees, trousers of the same color and standard issue watch boots, then cocked an eyebrow. It was quite evident Tristan had already had a look. "What's your name?" Lieutenant Wen asked. "Tristan." A spark of recognition in the Tianxi's dark eyes. "You know," the corpulent man said, pushing back his glasses, "when I first enrolled in the watch, the argument of the day was whether or not the cryptia should be folded into the academy. The largest of the circles, Tristan knew. The academy trained officers, the stripes, which was not so mystical or exciting as navigators or militants, but significantly more useful in running something as large as the watch. Why? He asked. He was, after all, being invited to. Because there's as almost as many stripes as there is other people in all the other circles combined, while the cryptia is by far the smallest, Lieutenant Wedden idly said. It was a prestige thing, too. There are 2 guilds in the guildhouse and 3 societies in the college. Why shouldn't the stripes bring a second circle under the academy banner? The large Tianxi smiled. It got as far as them talking about what the new name for the stripes would be, since they wouldn't be the whole academy anymore, before the scandals started coming out. Tristan swallowed a smile. Predictable. Turned out those officers were skimming off conclave funds, contracting off the books, or fucking someone they shouldn't, Wen said. Every single one of them. Funny, that. You'd think at least one was clean. Life is full of coincidences, the thief blandly said. That and shallow graves, the lieutenant smiled. I dug a little into the archives at the Rook's Nest, boy, and found out this happens about every 50 years or so. The academy starts making noises, then there's a pointed rash of scandals and accidents. Tristan blinked. And they have not considered simply stopping. He slowly said. I figure it's too big a beast to learn, nowadays, Lieutenant Wen replied. The masks only cut off one of the Hydra's heads at a time, so the others keep biting. That's not the point of this little story, though. I am all ears, the thief said. The point is that Cryptia is a bunch of shifty assholes not above fucking their brothers and sisters in the black even when they don't deserve it, the Tianxi coldly said. And that if whatever you're up to hurts any of mine, I will find a way to keep you awake and alive while we hammer our entire supply of nails into your body one at a time. The bespectacled lieutenant tapped a finger right between his eyebrows, still smiling. pop," Lieutenant Wen said. "One at a time, Tristan." The Tianxi searched his face, carefully kept blank, then nodded in satisfaction. "Good," he said. "Now let's have a look at those supplies." The depot was much the same as when he had last come, half a watch armory, uniforms and arms included, and the rest piles of arms and clothes from those who had died in the trials. The blast cloaks did not appear to have wall hammers, unsurprisingly, given that it was equipment used mostly by explorers and thieves, but Tristan took from their stock a pair of leather gloves that fitted him well. After that he went fishing through the piles of dead men's possessions, while Lieutenant Wen apathetically resumed struggling with his jerky. Though he found a hammer, it was too large. More a war hammer than a work one. There was, however, a war pick in a pile with horseman's leathers. A little heavy, but it had the right parts, beacon hammer, and by the short length of the handle it had been forged for someone shorter than him. It would serve. "Done?" Lieutenant Wen asked. "Done," Tristan lied. Their forge was in the open and its grounds more often used for woodcutting than smith's work, so it was not difficult to wait until the guards and patrolmen were otherwise distracted and get his hands on a few things. A small hammer, much easier to work with, and a set of 12 large steel bolts likely meant as spares for the oven. He stashed it all away in one of the broken bastions. As afternoon stretched towards evening and Tristan finished his nap, the crews started to return. Tupac sickles first and in a fine mood. They came strutting back and without a casualty, with the only wound cuts on Feli's leg, which the man boasted of, as he'd got them in the process of beating a god's test. 2 victors, they claimed, Felis and Tupac each having triumphed over a test. Mariam sat with Lan to get a report, learning that their crew had taken the Serpent Shrine. That god's test, to cross a room full of snakes, was beaten when Tupac walked through and shrugged off getting bit a dozen times. Lan had checked and he'd suffered no consequence save some sweat. More than that, there was now no trace of any snake bite on his skin. That, Tristan thought, looked like quite the troublesome contract. The crew had then spent a long slice of the afternoon breaking their way through a crypt unguarded by any god, taking turns with O'Cutlin's hammer to smash through plaster walls. It led them to some kind of large arena littered with nonsense weapons where another test awaited, seemingly a simple test of strength against a bear, but in truth some kind of riddle. Felis, who it turned out was fond of these, slew the bear with a sort of paper fan whose name could also mean honeycomb. He took a slash to the leg getting close, but a shallow one. Lan thought he had gotten very lucky already knowing the riddle and insisted he had been completely insufferable since. They had hit the equivalent of a dead end when they were presented a choice between a broken bridge and a temple whose test was too brutal, a god demanding they play some kind of game of chance where every loss would mean losing a finger or toe. They were now preparing equipment, ropes and hooks, to try to cross the broken bridge on the morrow. The crew under the Ramayan stumbled in an hour later, haggard in a collection of wounds. Ishan Nair had a disfiguring cut going up through both his lips. Ferrando Vilazar was limping on a bandaged leg. Brun and Akanthi's faces were red as if brushed too close to flame, and Young's top knot had been sliced off. His hair fell in uneven disorder. Only Shalini Go looked unscathed, but at least they did not seem to have lost anyone. Tristan himself sat with Young for the report. The Lion Shrine was easy enough, Young told him. One of us was to run a gauntlet of 10 duels against the shades of increasingly larger beasts, and could withdraw, but only at the price of a pint of blood. Gol breezed through, finished almost every fight within the first 3 breaths. Never seen anyone so fast with pistols. Another likely contract. And after? Young grimaced. We found a shortcut, a narrow overpass that went on for half a mile, he said. No railings and high up, but not so difficult if we took our time. Only it was older than we'd thought. It collapsed, Tristan guessed. We got lucky, the Tianxi sighed, confirming with a nod. We fell into water, some kind of shallow canal, and the only one to get hurt was Ferranda. We followed the current, as it was headed the right way, but it led to some kind of waterfall facing furnaces. Brun and Akanthi foes look burned, Tristan said. A tongue of fire flared out, came close to catching them when they were looking over the waterfall's edge, Yang said. It was a dead end, so we had to double back against the current. The canal was fed into by some kind of storm drain, so we went up that and reached a crossroads with 4 shrines. The dark-haired man let out a long breath. We agreed we needed to secure a way back first, so we tried the one leading back towards the old fort, Yang said. It seemed straightforward enough, a test of skill with pendulum blades to avoid in order to reach the other end of the room. The terms were generous, even, no lantern bet, only it must be at least 2 of us taking the test. You and I, Han, the thief said. Yang grunted in agreement. It was a trap, he said. The chamber itself began spinning and more blades came out of the other walls. Nothing larger than a mouse could cross that room without losing limbs, not with so many moving parts. Even just getting out got us cut. So how did you return? He asked. We went over the shrine, climbed up the sides, Yang said. Which the god took offense to. It collapsed its own shrine's ceiling. 2 heartbeats quicker and it would have killed Firanda. They had doubled back to the old fort after that, the Tianxi elaborated, and avoided taking any more tests. It had meant taking long and exhausting detours that further chipped away at everyone's mood. With so many wounds and a single victor to show for it, their first day did not feel like a success. The mood of the Ramayan crew was downcast and stayed that way as they patched their wounds and planned the following day's expedition, while Felix strutted about, loudly telling others of his cleverness in the test he had beat. It was only when Angharate Tredegar came back carrying a corpse that perspective set in. Inyani Duma had been butchered by some sort of large cutting implement, by the looks of it, and her wounded nephew was walking a ragged edge. His eyes were red and the glint in them wild, just itching for something to lash out at. Much as Tristan wanted to find out what had happened to their crew, Zenzel Duma's look warned him off it. His instincts were proved right when within half an hour the Milani ended up smashing Feli's face in after the man boasted a little too mockingly. They were pulled off each other by their crews, but the thief decided to steer well clear. The only angle he could see for getting eyes in that crew was your Etsy, and he would not risk that without first getting a better read on her. Perhaps aware that the day's course did little to strengthen her crew's position, Shalini did not approach him at dinner for recruitment again. Tristan sat with the other Humbities, only half paying attention to the conversation as he watched the undercurrents of the rest of the table. A corpse being brought in had settled the mood in the Ramayan crew somewhat, but it was still shaky. Ironically enough, Tredegar's own company seemed more united than they. Whatever the nature of the death, it did not seem to have shaken their faith in the Perduri. As for Tupac, his unambiguous victories were propping up his position. Already his crew looked less like they were waiting for the gallows, and Tufti himself was still disreputable. The others under him were not being treated as if they carried the plague anymore. That tentative thaw would not last if the streak of successes broke, Tristan thought, but if it continued. Something to keep an eye on. After the meal and some huddled talks between the crews after it, most headed for bed. It had been a long and bloody day, with tomorrow promising to be much the same. For Tristan, however, night was the beginning of the work. He had napped through the afternoon for a reason. There was precious little sleep ahead of him. There was no curfew in the old fort, so it was a simple matter of timing. Beatrice had gone on a walk around the courtyard at midnight, the previous evening, so a little before that Tristan snuck out of his bedroll and slipped into the kitchen. When she came out with her blast cloak escort, same as last night, he came out of the shadows and sat down at a table facing her. He made sure that his hands would be flat on top of the table and there were no visible weapons on him, making it clear he was no threat. He was still faced with a naked sword within moments. "Back to your bed," the watchman flatly ordered. Tristan ignored the armed man, instead seeking Beatrice's eyes. She hesitated for a moment but ended up nodding. "It is fine, Sergeant Chabert," Beatrice said. "Tristan is an old acquaintance. This is not an unpleasant surprise." The watchman hesitated but she smiled. "I would talk with him a moment, if you please," Beatrice said. "We can resume our walk afterwards, yes?" The man sheathed his sword, but his eyes were still hard. "Say the word if you need me," Sergeant Chabert said. You are under the Watch's protection now. To harass you is a breach of sanctuary rules. Ah, confirmation that Beatrice had withdrawn from the trials. He had been nearly certain, but it was good to know for sure. The watchman stepped away, far enough he would not be able to listen in, but hardly a step further than that. Tristan ignored his glaring. He had come here for answers and he would have them. "Do you still have the ruby?" he idly asked. Beatrice's jaw clenched. "I promised to keep an ear out for you," she acknowledged. "I'll not go back on that. What do you want to know?" First, something he had been itching to know, however marginal the use of holding that information. "Why is Isabel Ruesta still taking the trials?" Tristan asked. "The cousin she wanted to pursue is dead." Beatrice softly laughed. "She fucked herself," the other rat told him. "Lord Ruesta only let her risk the Dominion because she told him she was trying to choose between the Sheridan brothers. She argued that danger would let her see the true face of them. Only she does not want to marry either," the thief slowly said. "Unusually sensible of the Infanzona. She despises them," Beatrice snorted. "She goaded the Sheridans into following her because they are so awful she would lose no sleep over sacrificing them." Tristan hummed. "But now she is stuck," he laid out. "Her way out was seducing the cousin, but the man is dead. Worse, Augusto was revealed to be unsuitable, so if she withdraws from the trials then she will be married off to Raymond. That was why you needed to be careful with cover stories. Sometimes you ended up having to live up to them." Tristan had got off light pretending he was deaf for a month. "She would rather cut her own feet off than marry the shit," Beatrice confidently said. "She has dozens of better prospects wriggling on her hooks back in Sacramonte. And the simplest way out of her blunder was hardly difficult to figure out. So she must stick around to ensure her friend Raymond has an accident," Tristan mused. One had to commend Lady Isabel for her industriousness. Not yet married and already she was arranging the divorce. It appeared that the issue of lacking eyes and ears among Angharade Tredegar's crew would not be so unsurmountable a problem after all. The Infanzona should be quite willing to pass information in exchange for a little help on the path to preemptive widowhood. Why, he was almost beginning to approve of Isabel Ruesta. What rat would not applaud a snake intent on eating others of her kind? "Tell me about Brun," he asked. Beatrice looked surprised. "I didn't think you cared much about him and Ren," she said, then worried her lip. She spent a little while in thought. He decided early on that Tredegar was the ally to secure and he went after it straightforwardly, Beatrice said. He was also courting Bracida, but... She hesitated. Tristan leaned in. "But... I'm not sure I buy it," Beatrice admitted. He's merc, I could tell even if she couldn't, and she was never shy about her opinion of rats. Oh. That was interesting. Tristan had suspected the man to be, for he did not act like some shopkeeper's son, but that had been only a guess. "You're sure?" he asked. She nodded. Tredegar mentioned his parents were trench miners, Beatrice said. More than decent odds, then, as not even the foreman of the trench could claim to live well. "It's strange, though," the former maid continued. "He got restless when we began to run out of food, even Lady Isabel noticed. And a rat should be used to a little hunger," Tristan finished. "That was unusual. Contract?" he asked. "Something that allows him to feel when people get close," Beatrice shrugged. He stayed vague about it. Some kind of detection contract. Not what he would have associated with a god that Fortuna called Loud, but the goddess did not think the way a human might. Loud, to her, could very well mean a different thing entirely. Perhaps the means of detection were loud to other gods, or somehow garish. Or he is acting odd because his god sticks closely to him, Tristan considered. He too acted in a way that seemed strange from an outside eye because of Fortuna's foibles. Brun might simply be a skilled operator making the best of his circumstances and nothing more nefarious. Time would tell. "Songran," he asked. "Hates Lady Isabel's guts and isn't all that good at hiding it," Beatrice said. "It got worse as we traveled together. Yet she is sticking with the remains of your old crew," Tristan informed her. "Including Isabel Ruesta." That clearly surprised the other Sacramontan. "She was tight with Lady Angharade," Beatrice slowly said, or at least trying to be. In a bedsport way? The dark-haired woman shook her head. I would say sisterly, but that's not quite it either, Beatrice said, biting her lip. It was almost as if she was humoring Tredegar by letting her take the lead. I do not believe she saw herself as subordinate the way Brun did. Miriam had never said why it was she had gone with the leftovers during the trial of lines. A demonstration of signs, or even just the map she had memorized, would have seen her add it to Inyani's company in a heartbeat. Yet instead she had stuck with him, much as Song was sticking with Angharad Tredegar. Special enrollment, the thief thought. Miriam had admitted that she and Song were there for the same reason, and the way they acted was telling. They were making allies not just for these trials, but for what would come after, the secret opportunity that would be afforded to the recommended. Miriam had picked him and Song had picked Angharad Tredegar. You put something together, Beatrice said, eyes intent. Maybe, Tristan demurred. I cannot be sure. Maybe, she softly said. But you are anyway. The thief hid his irritation at being seen through. He was losing his touch of late. Who are you really, Tristan? Beatrice asked. You're not just some boy from the Merc. She stared him down. Those don't murder hardened killers twice their size and make it look like an accident within hours of meeting them. It seemed boldness was making an appearance now that the protection of the watch made her all but untouchable. She was overplaying her cards, however. He could not touch her, but neither could she touch him. That would be interfering in the trials, and the moat she was hiding behind went both ways. So instead of answering, he rose to his feet, ignoring the weariness on her face, to offer her his hand to shake. Good luck, he said, in Sacramenti. Her face tightened. That's it. He shrugged. What else should there be? They were rots keeping to their common law, and with this conversation all their debts were settled. Tristan would keep no grudge over their dealings, which had been fairer than not, but a choice had been made before they ever left the Blue Belt. They were bound by transaction and nothing more. She was not Miriam, who had chosen him and been chosen in turn. Beatrice stared at him, gaze searching for something, but whatever it was she did not find it. Her eyes strayed away. Goodbye, Tristan, Beatrice said. She did not shake his hand, and he did not offer it again. What was the best way not to be caught? It was, sometimes, to be caught for something else entirely. When people were certain of where you were and why you were there, they put you in the box of affairs that were settled. Tristan, for example, had been out at night, but his purpose was obvious. He had been trying to speak with Beatrice. So when he trudged back to his bedroll afterwards and closed the curtain behind him, he shed the suspicions of the watch. They had accounted for him. He went into the box. That made it much easier to sneak out a second time a little over an hour later. The timing was careful. Like the previous night, a light appeared high on the pillar, above the bastion with the astronomical equipment, and a rope ladder was lowered. 6 watchmen came down, all of them heading straight for the barracks, and in their wake a 7th followed. Unlike the others, she did not head down the bastion stairs, instead setting down a sheath of papers on a table and busying herself with the telescope. She was, Tristan saw, looking at the machinery above the one whose golden moving parts mimicked the sky, stars and moons moving around. Pressed close in the shadows below the bastion, Tristan waited until Fortuna returned from having her look. She strutted back as if she had single-handedly won a war, which in truth was not all that different from her usual walk. She looked so meshwari, the goddess confirmed. 30s or very kind 40s. Tristan smiled. There was a decent chance, then, that as deduced last night he had found the missing Lieutenant Vasanti. He had not been able to find out during the day how many watchmen there were in the old fort, as from a distance their black cloaks made them very difficult to tell apart, but he doubted there could be many posted up there. The practicalities of food and shit would dictate otherwise. Even a chamber pot needed to be emptied eventually. He must make the climb now, though, for eventually the soldiers that had come down would be replaced or themselves return. Getting out of the old fort was not all that difficult, as the watch kept an eye mostly on the openings in the walls. Climbing down the side of the northeastern bastion with his tools wrapped in a blanket was slow work more than strenuous. It was after that, when he stood outside the fort in one of the blind angles of the ramparts, that the real work began. Taking out the work hammer and a few spikes, he began to hammer himself a way up. The way to do it without noise was to hammer the spike through cloth, to kill the echo, but that made precision difficult. Tristan had long been trained out of any fear of heights. It would be too much of a disability for a thief, but he still found his nerves thinning as he rose up the side of pillar. His boots rested on spike after spike while he nailed one above, at the precise intersection of the building stones under the plaster so the length of steel would slide in securely. His work slowed further when he got halfway up and began pulling every third spike with the side of the war pick, for otherwise he was sure to run out before the end. His muscles ached and his limbs began to tremble from the tension, but by the time he had got to the right height he saw that he had been blessed with a stroke of luck. Lieutenant Vicente had left the bastion with the telescope, going to the supply depot, which left him an open path. The last stretch was the worst. It was the easiest to hammer in, for now that he had gone up the pillar he was following the curve of the stone towards the entrance where the rope ladder led, but he was exhausted and uncomfortably aware that all it would take for a blast cloak to see him was someone shining a lantern in his direction. Below he could see a few watchmen spread across the walls, a few walking around the ramparts. None cared to look up, so he remained safely hidden in the shadow of the great pillar, shielded from the golden light of the other machine above. He was careful not to leave a trail, removing every spike he did not stand on, and about an hour after he had begun Tristan found himself about a foot below the opening in the pillar from which dangled the rope ladder. Pressed into the shadows below that slender opening, he was hidden from below, and needed to be, for Lieutenant Vicente and another blast cloak had returned to the bastion. They were talking, discussing charts by the telescope, but if the rope ladder began to move they were sure to notice. Instead Tristan stretched up from the spike, hoisting himself onto the stone, and wriggled inside. Scorch marks, he noticed as he crawled on the floor. They blew their way in. And then he'd made it in. There was no telling what the chamber had been before the watch moved in. The walls and ceiling were bare stone, with only small marks betraying that at some point weighty objects had been dragged across the floor. It had since been turned into an outpost that could not quite decide what it was meant to be. A handful of bedrolls were propped up against the left wall, a rack of swords and muskets the right one, and in the back there was some kind of office. Stacks of papers were piled up everywhere around the wooden desk and the small cabinet flanking it. There was only one seat, a broad chair behind the desk, and that was where Tristan's eyes stayed. There was someone sleeping in it. An old woman in a black cloak, white-haired and wrinkled. She snored away, cheek pressed on top of the desk, and slightly drooled on the wood. Given the Someshwari look of her and the seniority implied by age, she had to be in her 60s at least. Tristan realized that he had been wrong after all. It had not been Lieutenant Vicente on the bastion, because he was looking at her now. She looked frail, but there was a pistol atop a pile of papers that would make that point moot. His climb had been quiet, and he had not woken her by entering the chamber, but he still felt stomach clench. There was almost no cover in the room to hide behind. He could not stay out in the open, he was sure to be caught, so the thief smoothed out his breathing and looked for the exit. There was bound to be one. No one would set up in this eagle's nest without a reason. As he'd thought, tucked away besides the bedrolls was a discreet opening of the wall through which he glimpsed stairs in the flickering light of the chamber's sole lamp. There was, despite sweeping the room twice, no sign of anywhere leading down. An isolated chamber? The size of this room was no more than a third of the great pillar's length, at a look, so there might be others carved inside the stone. Regardless, up the stairs was the way he must head. He would find no answers here, only get caught by the watch. Creeping across the floor on all fours, careful not to make a sound as he moved towards the bedrolls and the stairs, the thief kept an eye on the sleeping officer. One foot after another, until he was halfway through the row of bedrolls, and then the snoring stopped. Tristan pulled at his luck before he even turned to look, only realizing his mistake when he saw Lieutenant Vicente had not moved. Her eyes were still closed and she still lay on top of the desk. Shit, he had borrowed luck for nothing. That was. No, best get up the stairs before releasing it. It was too dangerous out here. He began to move again, only to be given pause when he heard someone pulling at a stuck drawer. He hurried to his feet only for Lieutenant Vicente to curse, snatching the pistol atop her desk and firing a shot right into his chest. A plume of smoke came bursting out, and as he threw himself down to the right, the thief only spared a moment of incredulity at this being luck, only for the explosion of pain he was awaiting not to come. "Ovia," the old woman cursed. "Gods, girl, but I will have you caned until you learn to load your pistol properly." There had been, he realized, no ball to go with the powder. Tristan released the lock, preparing himself for disaster, and still missed it. The weapons rack fell onto his back as he began to rise, a massive wood and a dozen swords crashing down onto him. He wriggled free, hearing the sound of a drawer forced open, but by the time he got onto his knees with a few bruises to show for it, a cool muzzle was pressed against his forehead. Lieutenant Vicente's rheumy green eyes were cold as the steel she held in her hand. "Move and die," the old woman said. "Understood." "Understood," Tristan replied. Could he get free of this? Pulling on the lock again, most likely. It was what came after that worried him. There was a witness to him being inside the pillar. He was not, strictly speaking, breaking the rules by being here. The pillar was not off limits, the way the barracks and bastion were. Yet it was impossible for him to have come here without having broken the rules, an offense Lieutenant Wen had made clear would earn summary execution. "You're one of the kids from the trials, yes?" Lieutenant Vicente said. He did not answer, so she pressed the muzzle forcefully against his skin. "Yes," he said. He could not see a way out of this without killing the watchwoman, which would not be an act without consequences. And a shot was fired. We are bound to have been heard. Other blast cloaks would be on their way. Was all already lost? Would killing her be pointless? Either way, Tristan must make his decision soon. "Name?" she pressed. He hesitated, but saw her hand begin to clench. "Tristan Abrascal." "You're one of the cryptic prospects," Lieutenant Vicente grunted. "One of the two died, I heard, so which are you?" He blinked. "I don't know," he slowly said. A moment passed and he settled into the decision. He saw only one way to survive, and though it might see him die later, it was always better to breathe than not. He would strike when she got distracted. "Fuck," the old woman feelingly said. "You're too calm. You're Nere's pet project, aren't you?" He paused. "Abuela?" he ventured. "Grandmother," she translated, disgust rippling across her face. "Gods, that's sick." A sigh and the pistol went up. "On your feet, boy," Lieutenant Vicente said. "I should shoot you for sneaking in here, but you're not worth a feud with Nere. There are too many ways to make it look like an accident at my age." Tristan, disoriented by the realization that he was not going to have to kill his way out of this after all, hesitantly rose to his feet. He flicked a worried glance backwards. "There's no one coming," the watchwoman told him. "This entire construction swallows noise. The makers did not want the machinery noises to echo around the cavern." Lieutenant Vicente stepped away from him, going to sit atop her desk after pushing aside a few papers. "So you got curious and decided to go sniffing around our work, did you?" she said. Tristan weighed his options, trying to get a read on her face and finding that there was little there to find but steel. The maze can't be the only way through, he decided to risk. The pillar is much older, and the antediluvians would have needed access to the machinery in the ceiling. "Been a while since a trial taker figured that out," Lieutenant Vicente noted. "We try to keep them looking forward instead of up." "There's something wrong with this place," Tristan quietly said. This was not built to be a trial, even if the watch turned it into one. The old woman considered him coolly. "Best you keep that tongue in your mouth, boy." She tapped the side of her pistol against her fingers thoughtfully. "What to do with you now?" "Punishment, even if he was not killed, but the thief could not afford that. It would all come falling down on his head if he was made an example of now, even if he got away with a mere caning or flogging." "She's the key," Tristan thought as he watched Lieutenant Vicente. "So what did he have to move her?" Nothing, at a glance, but that was never true. What did he know? Old but still a lieutenant, he thought, which was unusual. She knew Abuela, or claimed to, and had Mariam not said that the seal Abuela used to recommend him was the mark of a higher rank. She had also implied that she had seen more than a year of trials being taken. Lieutenant Wen had said there was a tinker from the Yamuthi Society at the old fort, when going on one of his grisly rants. The pieces came together. "How far did you get in finding the way up?" he asked. Lieutenant Vicente stilled. "Definitely one of Nore's," she said. "You have the same unpleasant nose for secrets. That's why you're here, isn't it?" he said. "For the etheric machine above. I'll bet you even took a demotion so you could stay assigned at the old fort." "Sometimes it can be hard to tell," the old woman said, "whether you're digging out of the grave or digging it deeper. Would you like me to tell you which it is you're doing, boy?" Lieutenant Wen said there was a tinker, he said. "A tinker? This isn't a watch study, you would have a team for that. It's yours." "Clever," Lieutenant Vicente acknowledged. "But cleverness does not impress me." "What does that matter?" Tristan straightened, put a confident smile on his face. "I have a team for you," he said. "A clockmaker, a historian with a contract, a sign user and even eyes in the maze for those things the watch won't let you send people to look for." The old lieutenant went still, studying him with unblinking green eyes. "You think I'll let you dig at our secrets just because you have some tools for me to use, boy?" His facade of calm did not waver. "I think you have less than a decade to live and you chose to be here, eating bad food on this misbegotten island with none of your old friends. I think the telescope isn't watch equipment at all, that you had it brought in, and for you to do that you must have been here for years now." "Yes," Tristan simply replied. A heartbeat of silence, then the old woman laughed. She set down her pistol on the table and it was an effort not to let out a breath of relief. "I can't help but notice you didn't put yourself on the list," Lieutenant Vicente said. "But that's fine, Tristan Abrascal." Her grin was neither pretty nor friendly. "I have a use for you too,